Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Settle into whatever place feels comfortable. Let the room grow quiet. You may be listening from a bed, a couch, a desk, or somewhere far from home. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice how easily you can leave that room. There is probably a door within reach. You could stand up, turn the handle, and walk outside without asking anyone for permission. That simple freedom is worth remembering tonight, because the place we are visiting was filled with people who could not do the same. This is the story of the Philadelphia State Hospital at Byberry, one of the largest and most notorious psychiatric institutions in American history. It stood in the northeastern part of Philadelphia, spread across hundreds of acres near the city's outer edge. During its long existence, it was called several different names. Officials described it as a farm, an institution, a hospital, and eventually a modern psychiatric centre. Most people simply called it Byberry. The name became familiar across Philadelphia. Parents used it as a warning. Newspaper readers associated it with investigations and scandals. Former employees remembered endless wards, difficult shifts, and a system that never seemed to have enough people or money. Former patients remembered something more personal: locked doors, crowded rooms, strict routines, and the knowledge that the outside world was continuing without them. Before we enter that history, let me ask you a question. Where are you listening from tonight? And what does the word hospital mean to you? Most of us hear that word and imagine a place designed to help. A hospital is where someone goes when the body is injured, or the mind becomes overwhelmed. It may be frightening, but the purpose is supposed to be clear. Doctors examine the problem, nurses provide care. Families wait for news. The goal is recovery, or at least relief. Byberry began with language that sounded reasonable. Philadelphia had too many people living in terrible conditions at an older public institution, and the city needed somewhere else to send them. The new site was outside the crowded centre, where there was land, open air, and room for patients to work. Officials believed that farming, regular activity, and distance from urban pressure might improve the lives of people who had been classified as mentally ill. That was the public idea. The institution that developed from it would eventually become a warning about what can happen when a society removes vulnerable people from public view and then stops paying attention. We should also be careful with the words used in this history. Records from the period contain labels that are now recognised as insulting, inaccurate, or harmful. People were called lunatics, idiots, imbeciles, defectives, and inmates. Those were not casual insults written in the margins. They were official categories used by doctors, courts, city employees, and census workers. A label could determine where a person lived, whether that person could work, whether they could marry, and whether anyone believed what they said. Some people sent to Byberry had severe psychiatric conditions. Some had intellectual or developmental disabilities. Others had epilepsy, dementia, physical disabilities, alcohol dependence, or the effects of brain injuries. Some were elderly and had nowhere else to live. Some were poor. Some did not speak English well. Some behaved in ways their families could no longer manage. A person did not always need a precise diagnosis to enter an institution. They needed someone with authority to decide that they did not belong in ordinary community life. That distinction matters, because Byberry was never populated by one simple group of people suffering from one recognisable illness. It became a place where Philadelphia sent many of the people it did not know how to help. Before we continue, a brief request. If this kind of careful historical storytelling speaks to you, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. There is no need to interrupt the story to do it. You can wait until something stays with you. You can also leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. It is always interesting to see how far these old stories travel. Now let us go back to Philadelphia at the beginning of the 20th century. The city was already old by American standards, but it was changing quickly. Factories, rail lines, warehouses, row houses, and immigrant neighbourhoods had expanded across the urban landscape. Philadelphia was a major industrial centre. Its mills and workshops produced textiles, tools, machinery, ships, clothing, and countless other goods. The population had grown enormously during the 19th century, and with that growth came predictable pressures: poverty, overcrowded housing, disease, workplace injuries, homelessness, and a public welfare system that could not keep pace. People who were poor, sick, disabled, elderly, homeless, or mentally ill often passed through the same network of public institutions. The modern separation between a psychiatric hospital, nursing home, homeless shelter, disability service, and general hospital did not yet exist in the way we understand it today. Categories overlapped. Responsibility shifted between city departments. A person might enter one institution because of illness and remain there because there was nowhere else to go. For many years, Philadelphia housed large numbers of impoverished and mentally ill residents at the Philadelphia Almshouse and Hospital, commonly known as Blockley. Blockley stood in West Philadelphia and served many purposes at once. It treated the sick, housed the poor, and confined people described as insane. By the early 20th century, its psychiatric departments were severely overcrowded. The solution was not to build a small therapeutic hospital with carefully trained staff. Philadelphia looked instead toward land it already controlled in the Byberry section of the city. The area was rural compared with central Philadelphia. Farms, fields, roads, and scattered buildings occupied much of the surrounding land. It was distant enough to remove patients from public attention, but close enough to remain under city control. The city farms at Byberry were formally established in 1906, and the site initially functioned as a municipal institution connected to the city system for managing poverty and dependency. Pennsylvania archival records identify 1906 as the institution's founding year. The farm idea was important. At the time, many reformers believed outdoor work could be therapeutic. Fresh air was considered healthier than confinement in aging urban buildings. Physical labour was thought to provide structure, discipline, exercise, and a sense of usefulness. Patients could raise crops, tend animals, maintain grounds, and help support the institution that housed them. There was also a financial advantage that officials did not hide. Patient labour reduced operating costs. A person classified as mentally ill might work in a field, kitchen, laundry, boiler room, workshop, or maintenance crew. The institution benefited from that labour, but the patient usually had little control over the arrangement. Work could provide purpose and relief from a crowded ward, yet it could also become compulsory. The same activity could be described as treatment by an administrator and experienced as unpaid labour by the person doing it. This contradiction would follow Byberry throughout its existence. Practices presented as therapeutic often served the institution's practical needs first. In 1911, overcrowding at Blockley led Philadelphia to transfer some psychiatric patients to the city farms at Byberry. 2 years later, the city stopped admitting mentally ill patients to Blockley, making Byberry the primary public destination for many of them. The population grew with extraordinary speed. By 1914, the institution held 2,267 residents, making it larger than nearly every comparable public mental facility in Pennsylvania. Consider how quickly that happened. A rural site presented as a healthier alternative became responsible for more than 2,000 people within only a few years. Every patient required food, clothing, shelter, sanitation, supervision, and medical attention. Buildings had to be heated in winter. Laundry had to be washed. Sewage had to be managed. Patients experiencing confusion, fear, hallucinations, agitation, depression, or physical illness needed individual care. The institution did not grow because thousands of Philadelphians suddenly developed the same condition. It grew because the city had created a place to receive people who had previously been scattered through hospitals, almshouses, police stations, family homes, boarding houses and streets. Once that place existed, it began to fill. The first buildings did not resemble the giant abandoned hospital complex later remembered in photographs. Byberry developed over time. Additional structures were built as the population increased. Separate areas housed different groups. Men and women were divided. Patients considered calm or capable of working might receive greater freedom than those judged difficult. People with physical illnesses required different arrangements from those who were ambulatory. Staff needed residences, kitchens, storage buildings, workshops, and offices. From an administrative map, the expansion may have looked organised. Buildings had letters and numbers. Roads connected one part of the grounds to another. Departments produced reports. Superintendents counted admissions, discharges, illnesses, deaths, and expenses. Inside the wards, growth felt different. More beds were placed in rooms, then beds were placed closer together. When beds ran out, mattresses could be placed on floors. When trained attendants were unavailable, less experienced employees were hired. When employees left because of low pay, exhausting work, or dangerous conditions, the remaining staff carried larger responsibilities. This did not occur in one dramatic moment. There was no single morning when everyone at Byberry agreed that the institution had failed. The decline was gradual. A shortage became normal. A temporary sleeping arrangement remained in use. A damaged fixture went unrepaired. One employee watched more patients than any person could reasonably supervise. An individual who needed attention received restraint instead because restraint required less staff time. Each compromise made the next compromise easier. It is tempting to imagine the early years as a hopeful period followed by a sudden collapse. The evidence suggests a more uncomfortable reality. Byberry had problems built into its design from the beginning. It was expected to relieve pressure elsewhere, hold large numbers of people cheaply, and use patient labour to support its operation. Treatment existed, but custody was central. The institution's basic purpose was not only to heal, it was to contain. That word contain helps explain much of what followed. A hospital asks what care a person needs. A custodial institution often asks where a person can be kept. Those questions may lead to very different decisions. By the 1920s, Byberry was already becoming known as a vast public institution, rather than a simple farm colony. The city changed its official name more than once. In 1928, it became the Philadelphia Institution for the Feeble-Minded, using the terminology of that era. In 1931, it was renamed the Philadelphia Hospital for Mental Diseases. The changes reflected shifting administrative language, but a new sign did not reduce the population or improve every ward. The names also reveal the uncertainty surrounding the people housed there. Officials tried to classify residents according to the medical and social theories of the period. Those theories were often shaped by prejudice. Early 20th century America was deeply influenced by eugenics, a movement that claimed society could be improved by controlling who reproduced. Eugenic ideas were taught at universities, promoted by respected professionals, and incorporated into public policy. Poverty, disability, mental illness, criminal behaviour, and low performance on biased intelligence tests were sometimes treated as signs of hereditary inferiority. This gave institutions a disturbing additional purpose. Confinement could be presented not only as protection or treatment, but as a way to prevent supposedly undesirable people from having children. Not every doctor or administrator at Byberry held the same beliefs, and not every patient had the same experience. There were employees who tried to provide humane care under difficult conditions. There were attendants who learned patients' habits, helped them dress, listened to them, and intervened when others were cruel. There were patients who formed friendships, performed useful work, participated in recreation, and found some stability they had not experienced outside. A complete history must include those facts. it must also recognise that isolated acts of kindness could not repair a system that was becoming increasingly overcrowded and impersonal. Byberry's population continued to rise during the 1920s and 1930s. The institution received people from across Philadelphia's social world, but poverty shaped who remained there. A wealthy family might pay for private care, hire help at home, or move a relative to a smaller institution. Poor families had fewer choices. Once a relative entered Byberry, distance, transportation costs, shame, work obligations, and family conflict could reduce visits. Some patients were effectively abandoned. That word does not always mean their relatives felt no love. A mother might care deeply about an adult son but be physically unable to control him during a crisis. A husband might have children to feed and no way to remain home with a wife who needed constant supervision. An immigrant family might not understand the commitment process or might be told by an official that institutionalization was the only responsible choice. Families could be frightened, exhausted, and misled. They might believe the hospital would provide treatment that was unavailable at home. After admission, the institution could become difficult to challenge. Doctors and administrators possessed authority. A patient protesting confinement could have that protest interpreted as evidence of illness. Someone describing abuse might not be believed because their diagnosis had already weakened their credibility. This created one of the most dangerous features of institutional life. The people most capable of reporting mistreatment were often the people society had already decided not to trust. Picture an arrival during those early decades. A city vehicle approaches the grounds carrying several new patients. The road becomes quieter as it moves away from central Philadelphia. Fields replace dense blocks of row houses. The hospital buildings appear ahead, separated by stretches of open land. A person may have been told that this is temporary. They may have been told that doctors will examine them and send them home. They may not understand why they are there at all. An attendant records a name. Personal possessions are collected. Clothing may be removed and replaced with institutional garments. The new patient is washed, inspected, classified, and assigned to a ward. The door closes. The noises are immediate. Metal bed frames scrape against floors. Patients call out from across the room. Someone cries. Someone laughs without an obvious reason. An attendant gives instructions. The air carries the smells of disinfectant, sweat, damp clothing, food, and inadequate sanitation. There is no private bedroom where the patient can recover from the shock. Privacy is limited or non-existent. The person enters a routine that was established long before their arrival. Wake at the designated time, wash when directed, eat what is served, stand where instructed, work if assigned, wait through the long periods when nothing happens, sleep among strangers. The same open land that officials praised as healthy could make the institution feel more distant from ordinary life. Philadelphia remained nearby, but the patient's relationship with the city had changed. Streets, shops, churches, factories, and family kitchens belonged to the world outside. Inside Byberry, time was organised by bells, meals, counts, medication, work details, and locked doors. The city had removed a problem from Blockley, but it had not solved the problem. It had transferred it to a larger property where the consequences were less visible. By 1934, a national survey reported that Byberry held more than 4,500 people in a facility rated for approximately 2,500. That meant the institution was approaching twice its intended capacity. Private psychiatric facilities in the region operated on a much smaller scale, sometimes below their rated limits, while the public hospital absorbed thousands of people with nowhere else to go. The numbers explain much, but they do not tell us what overcrowding felt like. It meant sleeping close enough to hear every movement of the person beside you. It meant waiting to use a toilet that might already be broken or filthy. It meant eating in crowded rooms under hurried supervision. It meant attendants responding first to the loudest emergency while quieter suffering went unnoticed. It meant a person could spend hours, days, or years surrounded by people and still receive almost no individual attention. The hospital's population had become larger than that of many American towns. A later state report would describe Byberry as a metropolis among mental institutions. That description was meant to convey scale. It also captured the administrative problem. Byberry was no longer a collection of wards. It was a city whose residents had limited rights, whose government was the hospital administration, and whose streets did not lead freely outward. Philadelphia officials could see that the situation was worsening. Investigators visited. Reports were written. Newspapers published allegations. Reformers demanded action. Administrators requested more buildings, more employees, and more money. The usual response was expansion. This appears logical. If the wards are overcrowded, build additional wards. If one kitchen cannot feed everyone, construct a larger kitchen. If one building is deteriorating, replace it. But expansion also increased the institution's capacity to receive more patients. New space filled. Larger facilities required more staff. Budgets rose. The underlying assumption remained unchanged. People who could not be supported in the community would be sent away. Byberry became both the attempted solution and the growing problem. In 1938, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania took control from the city of Philadelphia. The official name became Philadelphia State Hospital. State management promised better organization, stronger funding, new construction, and professional reform. The transfer was a public acknowledgement that the city had failed to maintain acceptable conditions. For patients already living there, the change may have been announced through staff meetings, notices, new forms, or different lettering on official documents. The locked doors remained in place. The state inherited an institution that was overcrowded, understaffed, physically deteriorating and burdened by years of neglect. It also inherited thousands of human beings whose daily needs could not be delayed while officials debated plans. New buildings would come, new treatment methods would come, new drugs, new departments, new public promises, and new investigations would all come in time. Before any of that, there was the ordinary daily reality of Byberry. Waking in a packed ward, waiting for an attendant, eating institutional food, performing assigned labour, and learning how to live in a place that had been created to relieve overcrowding, but had become overcrowded almost immediately. To understand how Byberry gained its terrible reputation, we need to move beyond the distant view of the campus and enter the institution as it functioned during those crowded years. We need to look at who worked there, what patients were expected to do, how the wards were controlled, and why a hospital that kept expanding was still unable to provide the most basic forms of care. From a distance, Byberry did not look like one building. It looked like a settlement. The hospital occupied a large tract in northeast Philadelphia, far from the dense streets and industrial neighbourhoods that had supplied many of its patients. Roads crossed the grounds. Separate buildings stood across open fields. There were wards, kitchens, laundries, workshops, storage areas, offices, employee quarters, utility structures, and agricultural land. As the institution expanded, it developed the appearance and practical demands of a small municipality. That scale was not accidental. Byberry had been created to receive people who could no longer be accommodated at Blockley, and it continued to grow as Philadelphia's public system placed more responsibility on it. By 1914, only a few years after psychiatric patients began arriving, Byberry held 2,267 residents. By 1934, its population had risen beyond 4,500, even though the institution's rated capacity was approximately 2,500. A hospital holding several thousand people could not function like an ordinary medical building. It needed to feed a population larger than that of many towns. It needed heating systems, water, sanitation, transportation, repairs, security, and a constant supply of clothing and bedding. It needed employees to prepare meals, clean floors, maintain equipment, supervise patients, record admissions, manage medications, and respond to injuries. Byberry therefore became a city within Philadelphia, but it was a city with a very unusual population. Most of its residents had not chosen to move there. Many could not leave. The people controlling the institution were employees who went home at the end of their shifts, while the patients remained inside the system day after day. The grounds helped create the impression that Byberry was more humane than the crowded urban wards it had replaced. Fresh air, space, and agricultural work were common features of psychiatric institutions during this period. Reformers had long argued that people with mental illness should be removed from jails, poorhouses, and chaotic city environments. A rural setting was supposed to provide calm, order, and useful activity. At Byberry, the landscape also provided separation. The hospital was geographically close enough to Philadelphia to remain part of the city's public welfare system, but it was far enough from the centre that most residents rarely saw what happened there. A person living or working in another part of Philadelphia could pass years without entering one of the wards. Reports might appear in newspapers and rumours might circulate, but the daily reality remained behind institutional doors. Within those doors, patients were divided into groups. Men and women were generally housed separately. People considered able to work or move safely around the grounds might be assigned to more open wards or work crews. Patients judged violent, highly disturbed, medically fragile, or unable to care for themselves could be placed in more restrictive areas. Classification determined where someone slept, how much freedom they had, what duties they performed, and how closely they were watched. These decisions carried enormous consequences. A newly admitted person might arrive frightened, confused, or exhausted. Employees would record personal information and assign an institutional category. The assessment could be brief. Staff shortages and crowded admission systems left little time for extended observation. Once classified, the patient entered a part of Byberry that had its own rules and expectations. The experience varied from ward to ward. Some areas were calmer. Patients might have access to outdoor grounds, recreation, or useful work. A capable attendant could create order and reduce conflict. People who had spent years struggling without food, shelter, or reliable care might find stability in a regular routine. Other wards were dominated by noise, crowding, illness, and inactivity. Byberry became known for minimal custodial care, and many residents spent their days sitting in common rooms, wandering permitted areas, or performing repetitive duties. The institution offered shelter, but active treatment was limited for large parts of the population. The word hospital may suggest frequent meetings with physicians, careful examinations, and individualized plans. That was not the ordinary experience for many people at Byberry during its most crowded decades. There were doctors and nurses, but there were too many patients for the available professional staff. Much of the daily control of the wards fell to attendants. An attendant's job could include waking patients, helping them dress, supervising washing, distributing food, escorting work groups, preventing fights, cleaning accidents, and responding to psychiatric crises. Some attendants treated patients with patience and concern. Others used intimidation or force. Even well-intentioned employees could become overwhelmed when responsible for more people than they could safely manage. The institution's structure encouraged efficiency rather than individuality. Meals had to be served according to a schedule. Patients had to be counted. Doors had to be locked. Work crews had to depart and return at specific times. Clothing and bedding had to be collected in large quantities. The system worked best when residents moved together, ate together, and obeyed instructions without delay. That made personal preference a problem. A patient who refused to dress, eat, bathe, or move could interrupt the routine of an entire ward. Someone experiencing fear or hallucinations might not understand an attendant's instructions. A patient with dementia might wander. Another might react violently when touched. In a well-staffed therapeutic environment, these behaviours would call for observation, patience, and specialised care. In an overcrowded custodial institution, they could lead quickly to punishment, isolation, or restraint. Byberry's internal life depended heavily on work. The institution had begun as part of the city farms, and patient labour remained important as the hospital expanded. Residents worked in agriculture and performed tasks in kitchens, laundries, workshops, and maintenance operations. Work crews also helped to move supplies and care for the grounds. Administrators could describe this labour as occupational therapy. In some cases, it did provide real benefits. Work gave structure to the day. It offered movement, practical responsibility, and temporary escape from crowded wards. Patients might develop skills, form friendships, or gain access to areas of the institution that felt less confining. The hospital also relied on the work because it was inexpensive. Thousands of people required an enormous volume of food and clean clothing. Institutional farms could reduce food costs. Patient workers could perform jobs that would otherwise require additional paid employees. When budgets were limited, the distinction between therapy and exploitation became difficult to ignore. A resident might spend hours working for the institution while having no meaningful voice in the arrangement. Refusal could affect privileges or lead employees to judge the patient uncooperative. Payment, when available, was limited. The hospital benefited directly from labour performed by people whose freedom was already restricted. The laundry alone would have been a major operation. Bedsheets, blankets, uniforms, towels, and patients' clothing had to be washed continuously. In crowded wards, illness and incontinence increased the amount of soiled material. Large institutional machines, hot water, soap, carts, drying areas, and folding rooms were necessary to keep the system moving. The same was true of food preparation. Meals for several thousand residents could not be cooked as though each person were a hospital patient with an individual diet. Kitchens worked in bulk. Large containers, institutional ovens, storage rooms, and serving lines were required. Food had to be simple enough to prepare in huge quantities and inexpensive enough to fit within public budgets. Patients might eat in dining rooms or receive food within the ward, depending on their classification and physical condition. The quality varied. Even when food was nutritionally adequate on paper, the experience could be unpleasant. Meals might arrive cold, portions could be small, patients who ate slowly or needed assistance might not receive enough time. Everything at Byberry had to be organised around scale. The hospital kept statistical records describing the population by sex, age, race, citizenship, national origin, marital status, education, economic condition, and diagnosis. Annual reports also tracked whether patients were considered improved. These categories allowed administrators to describe thousands of residents and tables, even when the institution lacked the resources to know each person well. A table could show that a certain number of people had been admitted, discharged, transferred, or declared improved. It could not easily show what happened during the months or years between those events. For the patient, life was measured differently. Morning might begin with lights, bells, voices, or attendants moving through the sleeping area. In a crowded dormitory, waking was not private. Someone else might be shouting, coughing, pacing, or refusing to get up. Beds could be placed close together. Clothing and personal belongings were limited. The smell of the room depended on ventilation, cleaning, and the health of the people living there. Washing was conducted according to institutional arrangements rather than personal habit. Bathrooms and bathing areas were shared. People who required assistance depended on employees or other patients. Privacy could disappear almost completely. Breakfast followed. Then came work, recreation, treatment, or waiting. Waiting occupied a great deal of time in large psychiatric hospitals. Patients waited for meals, examinations, visitors, medication, work details, and permission to move. Those who had no assigned activity might sit for hours. A day room could contain many people doing very little. This inactivity was not always evidence that patients were incapable of more. It was often evidence that the hospital lacked programs, employees, and individual opportunities. A person who spent years without meaningful choices could gradually lose skills and confidence. The institution then interpreted that loss as proof that the person could not survive outside. This process became known as institutionalization. It did not refer only to admission. It described the way prolonged life inside a rigid institution could reshape behavior. Residents learned to depend on schedules and authority. Decisions that ordinary adults made for themselves were made by staff. When to eat, where to sleep, whether to go outside, and which clothes to wear could all be determined by the hospital. Over time, initiative could become risky or unnecessary. A patient who followed instructions might avoid conflict. A patient who insisted on personal choice might be labelled difficult. Silence and passivity could be rewarded because they made the ward easier to manage. This was one reason the institution could appear orderly during official visits while remaining deeply harmful to the people living there. A quiet room did not necessarily indicate comfort. It might indicate sedation, fear, exhaustion, or complete withdrawal. Byberry also had its own social hierarchy. At the top were state or city officials, depending on the period, followed by senior administrators and physicians. Nurses, attendants, maintenance workers, kitchen employees, and clerical staff occupied different levels within the organisation. Patients were placed at the bottom, though some patients gained limited authority through work assignments or cooperation with employees. A reliable patient worker could receive small privileges. That person might be allowed to move between buildings, carry supplies, assist in a kitchen, or perform tasks with less direct supervision. Such positions could improve daily life, but they also placed patients inside the institution's control system. Residents learned which attendants were fair, which were unpredictable, and which could be persuaded. They learned where to sit, when to speak, and how to avoid attention. Informal knowledge became a survival skill. The size of the grounds created additional challenges. Moving patients from one building to another required planning and supervision. Weather could make travel difficult. In winter, roads and walkways had to be cleared. In summer, heat affected wards that lacked adequate ventilation. Repairs were constant because the physical plant included so many structures. The central heating and utility systems were essential. A failure could affect entire buildings. Kitchens and laundries consumed large amounts of water and fuel. Sewage and waste had to be handled for a population of several thousand. Byberry's infrastructure made it look permanent. A small clinic can be reorganised or closed. A complex of roads, wards, farms, tunnels, power systems and service buildings creates its own momentum. Public money has already been spent. Employees depend on the institution for work. Officials depend on it to accept patients. Families depend on it because alternatives do not exist. Once Byberry became this large, Philadelphia could not easily replace it. That fact allowed serious problems to continue. Investigations could criticize the institution, but closing it would have required somewhere else to place thousands of residents. Improving it would have required sustained funding, more trained employees, better buildings, and a different philosophy of care. Expansion was easier to imagine than transformation. New wards could be built, more beds could be added, additional land could be used. Each physical addition appeared to address the immediate shortage while leaving the underlying system unchanged. Byberry therefore grew not because it was successful, but because the city and later the state needed it to keep accepting people. The transfer to state control in 1938 brought another name and another administrative system. Byberry officially became Philadelphia State Hospital on October 22nd of that year. The Commonwealth inherited the land, buildings, patients, staff shortages, and years of accumulated problems. State officials could now describe the institution as part of a broader hospital network. There were opportunities for new construction and professional reform. The term hospital suggested modern medicine rather than municipal poor relief. Inside the wards, the transition was less dramatic. Patients still woke in the same rooms, employees still reported for demanding shifts, kitchens still prepared thousands of meals, laundry continued to arrive in large carts, work crews crossed the grounds, doors opened and closed according to the same routines. The population kept growing. By 1947, Byberry held approximately 6,100 patients. The average annual cost per patient was reported as $346, a figure that reveals how little money was being spent when divided across housing, food, clothing, medical care, staffing, and maintenance. The institution now had the population of a substantial town, but it did not have the political rights or public accountability of one. Residents could not vote on hospital leadership. They could not choose how funds were spent. Many could not communicate freely with the outside world. Complaints passed through the same system being criticised. Employees also operated within strict limits. A nurse or attendant who wanted better conditions could report problems, but the hospital could not hire enough staff without additional funding. Administrators could request money, but legislators and public officials had competing priorities. Mental patients had little political influence, and many citizens preferred not to think about what happened behind the hospital walls. The scale that made Byberry useful also made it difficult to reform. There were too many buildings for maintenance crews to keep in good condition. There were too many patients for doctors to examine regularly. There were too many demands for attendants to respond to every person with patience. As staff shortages deepened, the hospital relied increasingly on control. Locked wards required fewer employees than open programs. Restraint could prevent movement when personal supervision was unavailable. Sedating medication, once it became more common, could reduce visible disorder. Work assignments kept some patients occupied and helped the hospital function. None of these practices had to begin with deliberate cruelty. They could emerge from pressure, shortage, and administrative habit. But once established, they created conditions in which cruelty was easier to hide. The institution also separated responsibility. A senior official could blame insufficient funding. An administrator could blame staff shortages. An attendant could blame dangerous patients. A city or state government could point to new construction and claim improvement. Each explanation contained some truth, but the patient still experienced the final result. A person could be hungry because the kitchen was underfunded, unwashed because attendants were overwhelmed, restrained because supervision was unavailable, and ignored because a physician had hundreds of other patients. No single decision created that experience. The whole institution did. The phrase city within a city helps us understand Byberry's physical size, but it also explains why the hospital became so isolated. It had its own routines, language, labour force, hierarchy, and expectations. People outside could imagine it as a medical facility. People inside understood that it was an entire enclosed world. Some residents adapted to that world and built lives within it. They knew the grounds better than new employees. They formed friendships and rivalries. They developed favourite places to sit. They performed jobs for years. They looked forward to visits, holidays, recreation, or small changes in routine. There were moments of kindness. A staff member might bring extra food, help write a letter, or speak gently to someone others ignored. Patients helped one another dress, walk, eat, and endure difficult days. Those acts mattered because the larger system offered so little personal attention. The hospital's ordinary functioning depended on thousands of repeated interactions. An attendant unlocking a door, a patient carrying a laundry cart, a nurse distributing medication, a kitchen worker filling containers, a physician signing forms, and an administrator counting beds. From the outside, those actions kept the institution operating. From the inside, they determined whether a patient experienced safety or fear. By the beginning of the 1940s, Byberry was no longer simply an overcrowded farm colony. created to relieve another hospital. It had become one of the largest psychiatric institutions in Pennsylvania and one of the clearest examples of custodial mental health care in the United States. Its buildings spread across the grounds, its population continued to rise, its internal economy depended on low public spending, exhausting staff work and patient labour. The distance between the institution's official purpose and its daily reality widened year after year. That distance would soon become much harder to conceal. During the Second World War, a group of young men arrived at Byberry to perform alternative service rather than join the armed forces. They entered the wards as attendants and workers. Unlike many visitors, they remained long enough to understand the routines. Some began writing down what they saw. Some found ways to photograph conditions that the public had rarely witnessed. Their accounts would reveal what life inside this city had become when the doors closed and no outsider was watching. The population figures written into Byberry's reports looked orderly. One column recorded admissions, another recorded discharges. Separate totals counted men, women, deaths, transfers, escapes, and patients described as improved. Names became case numbers, and case numbers became part of the hospital census. On paper, the institution could be measured. Inside the wards, the numbers occupied beds, stood in meal lines, waited outside bathrooms, and called for attendants who were already helping someone else. By the middle of the 1930s, Byberry held more than 4,500 people in a facility rated for about 2,500. The hospital was not slightly crowded. It held close to twice the population its buildings and services were intended to support. A private psychiatric hospital could limit admissions when beds were unavailable. Byberry had been created to take the people the public system had nowhere else to place. Turning them away did not remove the need. It only returned the problem to families, police departments, shelters, general hospitals, and city streets. This was how overcrowding became permanent. Each new arrival had an immediate reason for being there. A man might be experiencing delusions that made him dangerous to himself. An elderly woman might have dementia and no relatives capable of caring for her. A young person with an intellectual disability might have spent years at home until a parent died. Someone else might arrive after an arrest, a suicide attempt, a workplace injury, or a period of homelessness. The admission documents reduced these different lives to categories that the institution could process. Diagnosis, age, sex, race, marital status, occupation, and legal status were recorded. The Pennsylvania State Archive still holds annual reports and census books containing these classifications, along with dates of admission, discharge, escape, transfer, and death. The records show how carefully the hospital counted people even when it could not provide each of them with careful treatment. A census was easier to maintain than a therapeutic relationship. The staff needed to know how many meals to prepare and how many beds were occupied. Administrators needed totals for budgets and legislative reports. Physicians needed lists of patients assigned to their services. The state wanted evidence that its institutions were being managed. None of those tasks guaranteed that a frightened person would have someone available to listen. When Pennsylvania assumed control of Byberry in October 1938, officials inherited more than a group of aging buildings. They inherited a system organized around scarcity. There were too few employees, too many patients, and too many repairs that had already been postponed. Some structures were worn from decades of heavy use. Wooden floors had carried far more weight than intended. Plumbing and sanitation systems were being asked to serve populations beyond their original designs. State control offered the possibility of more money and broader planning. New buildings were proposed. Older areas were examined. Administrators could imagine a modern state hospital replacing the neglected city institution. The population did not stop growing while the plans were discussed. A person admitted during that transition still needed a place to sleep that night. If no proper bed was available, the hospital had to improvise. More beds could be moved into dormitories. Space intended for recreation or treatment could be converted into sleeping areas. Buildings designed for working patients could later become ordinary wards. Temporary arrangements continued because the pressure never disappeared. Overcrowding changed the purpose of every room. A day room intended for conversation and activity became a place where patients sat for most of the day because there was nowhere else to put them. A hallway became an observation area. A room built for a manageable number of residents became a dormitory filled with rows of beds. Storage spaces acquired uses their designers had never expected. The effect spread beyond sleeping arrangements. Bathrooms served too many people. Laundry accumulated faster than it could be washed. Dining rooms had to move patients through meals quickly. Medical staff could not examine everyone as often as they should. Attendants spent their shifts responding to the most urgent disturbances, while quieter needs remained unanswered. A patient who shouted struck another person, or damaged property attracted immediate attention. A patient who sat silently in soiled clothing might wait much longer. This created an institution in which the severity of suffering was not always the factor that determined who received help. Visibility mattered. Noise mattered. The risk of disruption mattered. People who could not communicate clearly were especially vulnerable. Overcrowding also increased conflict between patients. Psychiatric wards brought together people with very different conditions. One person might be confused and restless. Another might be frightened by noise. Someone might believe the other patients intended to cause harm. A person with epilepsy or a neurological disability could be placed near someone experiencing acute psychosis. Elderly residents shared spaces with younger adults. People capable of caring for themselves lived beside those who needed assistance with every basic task. Crowding removed the distance that might have prevented arguments or attacks. Beds were close together. Personal possessions were difficult to protect. There was little space to withdraw. Noise continued at all hours. Even a person who entered the hospital in a relatively stable condition could become distressed after weeks of poor sleep, loss of privacy, and constant exposure to other people's crises. Attendants were expected to control this environment. The job required strength, patience, judgment, and practical knowledge. It was also poorly paid and carried limited social respect. Many employees received a little preparation for the situations they encountered. A new attendant might enter a ward containing dozens or even hundreds of residents and learn by watching older workers. That could be useful when the experienced employee understood patients and knew how to calm them. It could be disastrous when the ward culture depended on threats and violence. Staffing problems did not simply mean that patients received less conversation. They changed the methods used to maintain order. Individual supervision requires people. Activities require people. Outdoor exercise requires employees who can accompany residents and respond if something goes wrong. De-escalating a frightened or aggressive patient can take time and several trained workers. Locking a door requires fewer employees. Tying someone to a bed requires fewer employees. Keeping patients together in a bare room requires fewer employees than organising work, education, recreation, and therapy. The hospital's shortages therefore pushed it toward the practices that required the least staff attention. These methods were often described as necessary precautions. In a limited sense, they sometimes were. An attendant responsible for a large ward could not safely watch every resident. A patient who repeatedly attacked others presented a real problem. The institution had created the conditions that made its harshest responses appear unavoidable. This pattern became worse during the Second World War. After the United States entered the war in December 1941, hospitals across the country lost workers to military service and better-paying defence employment. Men who might otherwise have worked as attendants entered the armed forces. Women found new opportunities in factories, military support services, and other jobs connected to wartime production. Trained medical personnel were needed by the Army and Navy. Psychiatric hospitals were already unpopular workplaces. The war gave potential employees more alternatives. Byberry's staffing problem became a national emergency, reflected in institutions throughout the United States. Thousands of residents still needed daily care, but many of the people who had performed that work were no longer available. The patients could not be drafted into another institution. They remained where they were. Existing attendants worked with fewer colleagues. Patient labour filled more gaps. Wards became harder to clean. Clothing and bedding were more difficult to manage. Medical attention became even less personal. At a military camp, an inadequate number of workers would have been recognised as an operational threat. Inside a psychiatric hospital, the same shortage remained largely hidden, because the people affected had little public influence. Wartime language emphasised sacrifice, duty, and national unity. Newspapers reported battles abroad and production records at home. Factories operated around the clock. Families followed casualty lists and rationed food or fuel. At Byberry, residents experienced another form of rationing. They received portions of attention. An attendant had a limited number of minutes and too many people who needed them. A nurse had medications to distribute across an entire ward. A physician could make brief decisions about restraint, treatment, or transfer without spending much time with the person involved. Care became something divided into smaller amounts until many patients received almost none. In 1942, a new group of workers arrived through the Civilian Public Service Programme. These were conscientious objectors, men who refused military service because of religious or moral opposition to war. Rather than serve in combat, they performed work considered important to the nation. Some fought forest fires, worked in agriculture, participated in medical experiments, or served in public health projects. Others were assigned to understaffed mental hospitals. The American Friends Service Committee operated Civilian Public Service Camp 49 at Byberry from 1942 until 1946. Over those years, 187 conscientious objectors worked at the hospital as attendants and orderlies. They entered an institution that regular employees understood as difficult and dangerous. Many of the new workers had little psychiatric experience. Their pacifist beliefs, however, affected how they responded to what they found. They had refused to participate in organised violence overseas. At Byberry, they encountered violence used as part of ordinary ward control. The newcomers were not the first people to recognise that the conditions were wrong. Patients knew it. Families had complained. Employees had raised concerns. Newspapers had reported scandals. Administrators had requested money. The conscientious objectors arrived with two advantages that many patients did not possess. They could leave when their period of service ended, and the outside world considered their written testimony credible. Their descriptions showed what overcrowding meant when translated from statistics into daily experience. One area was known among attendants as the incontinent ward. Patients there had serious physical and psychiatric needs. Many could not control their bladder or bowels. Proper care required regular bathing, clean clothing, clean floors, medical attention for skin problems, and enough employees to assist people who could not assist themselves. The ward lacked adequate furniture, activities, and therapy. Residents could be left sitting or moving across dirty floors. The smell remained in workers' clothing long after their shifts ended. Patients developed sores. Human waste became part of the environment rather than an urgent sanitation problem. This was not because the hospital had never heard of soap, clean clothing, or proper nursing. It was because hundreds of necessary tasks exceeded the labour available to perform them. Another area was known as the violent ward. Patients there attacked one another and sometimes attacked staff. Full-time attendants used straps to secure people to beds for long periods. Some workers used clubs, shortened broom handles, or lengths of hose weighted with buckshot to strike residents described as difficult. The objects were simple. That was part of what made them disturbing. Abuse did not require a secret laboratory or an official torture device. It could be carried out with whatever an attendant could hold. A broom handle belonged in the ordinary work of cleaning a ward. A hose belonged in maintenance. In the wrong hands, those tools became weapons against people whose complaints were unlikely to be believed. Not every employee participated. Some tried to protect patients. Some may have entered the job with good intentions and gradually accepted methods they once would have rejected. Others believed force was the only language certain residents understood. The ward environment rewarded immediate obedience. An attendant who calmed a frightened patient through conversation might spend 30 minutes doing it. An attendant who threatened or struck that patient could produce silence in seconds. In an understaffed institution, speed could be mistaken for competence. The consequences extended beyond the moment of violence. Patients watched what happened to others. They learned which employees used force. A person who had not yet been struck could become compliant from fear. Someone already paranoid could interpret the ward as proof that everyone intended harm. A resident who reacted defensively might then be classified as more dangerous. The system created the behaviour it claimed to control. The conscientious objectors experimented with different methods. Their commitment to non-violence did not mean they allowed patients to attack one another. They used physical intervention when necessary, but some tried to restrain people without beating them. They spoke calmly, separated fights, and attempted to reduce fear. The response could be noticeable. Patients learned which attendants were less likely to hit them. Conflict sometimes decreased when residents did not expect every confrontation to end in violence. This did not solve the hospital's structural problems, but it demonstrated that brutality was not always the unavoidable result of working with disturbed people. Byberry's defenders could point to the difficulty of the population. That difficulty was real. Some residents were capable of serious violence. Others required constant physical care. One worker could not safely manage dozens of people under all circumstances. The conditions still reflected public choices. Legislatures chose budgets. Administrators decided staffing levels and building uses. Courts and doctors continued sending people to the institution. Society accepted a system in which thousands of patients were placed behind locked doors with too few trained people to care for them. The Second World War exposed an uncomfortable contrast. The United States described itself as fighting against dictatorships that treated human beings as categories rather than individuals. American soldiers and civilians learned of imprisonment, forced labour, starvation, and medical abuse overseas. At home, conscientious objectors walked through wards where patients were naked, restrained, crowded, injured, and ignored. The comparison would later appear in public accounts of American mental hospitals. It was not an exact equivalence, and responsible reformers did not need to claim that it was. The important point was that democratic language did not automatically protect people hidden inside public institutions. A country could defend liberty abroad while denying basic dignity to residents at home. As the war continued, Byberry's population rose towards 6,000. New construction promised relief, but each addition was quickly absorbed by demand. A new kitchen could prepare more meals. A new ward could hold more beds. A new building could be described as modern. None of those improvements changed the policy that sent increasing numbers of people into long-term confinement. By 1947, the hospital held roughly 6,100 patients. Its average annual expenditure per resident was reported as only $346. That amount had to cover housing, food, clothing, staffing, maintenance, medical services, and the other costs of running the institution. The figure makes clear that Byberry was not funded as a place where thousands of individuals would receive intensive personal treatment. It was funded as a place expected to keep them alive at the lowest practical cost. Even that basic goal was not consistently achieved. Infectious disease spread easily in crowded institutions. Tuberculosis was a serious danger. Patients weakened by poor nutrition, inactivity, age, or chronic illness were vulnerable. When many people shared sleeping areas, bathrooms, and dining spaces, one illness could move through a building quickly. Medical isolation required rooms, equipment, and staff that were already scarce. Skin infections, injuries, and pressure sores could worsen without attention. A restrained patient who remained in one position needed careful monitoring. Someone unable to communicate pain depended on employees noticing changes. In a crowded ward, a small medical problem could become severe before anyone acted. Deaths entered the registers. The archives preserved names, dates, diagnoses, length of hospitalization, and causes of death. Each record marks a life that passed through the institution, but the formal entries reveal little about the final hours. They do not show whether someone had a visitor, whether another patient sat nearby, or whether an attendant noticed that the person was afraid. Byberry's scale made death both significant and routine. When a small household loses one member, every daily pattern changes. When an institution holding thousands records another death, the bed can be assigned to someone new. The pressure to admit patients continued because the social conditions outside had not improved enough to provide alternatives. Families still lacked affordable home care. Community clinics were limited. Effective psychiatric medications had not yet transformed treatment. Public assistance was fragmented. People with developmental disabilities or chronic mental illness were still expected to live either with relatives or inside institutions. If the family arrangement failed, Byberry waited. This made the hospital part of Philadelphia's social structure even for residents who never saw it. The possibility of commitment influenced how families managed difficult behaviour. Police officers knew where a confused or disturbed person might be sent. Doctors used the institution when private treatment was unaffordable. Judges could view confinement as a practical solution. Byberry absorbed the failures of many other systems. It absorbed poverty. It absorbed inadequate housing. It absorbed the absence of disability services. It absorbed elderly people whose families could not provide full-time care. It absorbed veterans, labourers, immigrants, and people displaced by illness or injury. Once admitted, all of them became part of the same institutional population. The state attempted to improve the physical campus. Plans called for new buildings and modern facilities. Construction continued during and after the war, though materials, money and labour were limited. A large kitchen and dietary building opened in 1946. Additional buildings followed for working patients and other groups. The new structures demonstrated that officials knew the old arrangements were inadequate. They also made Byberry larger. Every expansion increased the number of residents the hospital could be expected to accept. A building intended for a special purpose could be converted to general patient housing when overcrowding returned. Space created for work, recreation or treatment could disappear beneath additional beds. The state was trying to build its way out of a problem produced by policy. The conscientious objectors began gathering evidence. They wrote statements. They compared experiences with workers assigned to other psychiatric institutions. Some helped establish organizations devoted to mental health reform. Between 1944 and 1945, several men associated with the Byberry unit founded the National Foundation for Mental Health. Their goal extended beyond one hospital. They believed the conditions they saw reflected a national system that treated attendants as unskilled guards and patients as unwanted dependents. Documentation was dangerous because the hospital controlled access to the wards. Officials could dismiss written complaints as exaggeration. Employees who spoke publicly risked losing their jobs. Patients had little opportunity to contact journalists directly. Photographs offered a form of evidence that was harder to explain away. A conscientious objector named Charlie Lord carried a small camera beneath his clothing and secretly photographed conditions inside Byberry. He captured nakedness, crowding, idleness, and the physical environment in which patients were kept. The photographs did not show administrative tables or proposed buildings. They showed human bodies inside the system. When Eleanor Roosevelt saw the images in 1945, she was reportedly shocked to learn that they had been taken in Philadelphia rather than in some distant or impoverished region. In 1946, photographs from Byberry appeared in Life magazine as part of an article titled Bedlam 1946. which condemned conditions in American mental hospitals. A wider collection of testimony and images followed in the 1947 publication Out of Sight, Out of Mind. The title described more than public ignorance. Byberry had been designed around distance. It placed large numbers of vulnerable people in a location most citizens would never enter. Once the city transferred them there, daily attention shifted elsewhere. The institution remained visible as a name, a budget, and a group of buildings, but the individual residents disappeared from ordinary public life. The photographs reversed that process. They forced viewers to see people who had been reduced to totals. They showed that overcrowding was not merely an administrative inconvenience. It meant exposed bodies, dirty floors, empty rooms, restraints, and patients sitting without meaningful activity. Public officials disputed some of the reformers' conclusions. Pennsylvania authorities argued that the accounts presented a one-sided picture. That response was predictable and not entirely meaningless. A secret camera naturally focused on the worst conditions. Byberry also contained newer buildings, hard-working staff, organised services, and patients who were not being abused at every moment. The existence of better areas did not make the documented conditions acceptable. A hospital could not defend a ward where people lay in filth by pointing to another ward where the floors were clean. The controversy pushed Byberry into a national debate about psychiatric care. Americans who had rarely considered the daily life of institutionalized people now encountered images that were difficult to forget. Reformers demanded higher staffing, better training, stronger inspections, and more humane treatment. The hospital remained open. More buildings were planned. More employees were sought. Administrators promised that modernization would change the institution. The state could now argue that it inherited a disaster and needed time to repair it. For residents, time was not an abstract policy question. Every month of delay meant another month in the same ward. A patient restrained today could not benefit from a reform scheduled for next year. Someone developing an infection could not wait for a new medical building. A person losing the ability to speak, dress, or make decisions through years of institutional life could not recover those years later. Byberry had reached a point where too many people had arrived for the institution to provide what its name promised. It functioned as a hospital in official documents, but much of its daily work remained custodial. It stored, fed, counted, moved, restrained, and supervised people on a massive scale. The exposés made the public aware of the consequences, yet awareness did not immediately create alternatives. Philadelphia and Pennsylvania still needed somewhere to place thousands of residents. Families still needed help. Courts and doctors continued making commitments. The hospital could be criticised, expanded, and renamed, but it could not simply empty itself. That contradiction shaped the years that followed. New psychiatric treatments would offer the possibility of controlling symptoms that had once led to lifelong confinement. State officials would invest in buildings designed to look cleaner and more modern. Physicians would gain new drugs, machines, and procedures. Each innovation would be presented as a way to move beyond the crowded custodial wards. Inside Byberry, those new methods would be introduced into the same institution that had learned to solve difficult problems through speed, obedience, and control. By the time a person reached one of Byberry's locked wards, the larger questions about funding, public policy, and institutional reform had already become distant. The immediate concerns were more basic. Where would they sleep? Who controlled the door? When would they be allowed to wash? What would happen if they refused an instruction? How long would they remain there? For many patients, no one offered clear answers. Admission began with removal from ordinary life. A family member, police officer, physician, court official, or hospital employee might accompany the patient to the grounds. Some arrived during a severe psychiatric crisis and understood little of what was happening. Others were calm enough to recognize every stage of the process. They watched the city disappear behind them, entered an unfamiliar building, and surrendered control to people they had never met. Personal information was recorded. Clothing and belongings could be collected for storage. Staff examined the patient, assigned a diagnosis or administrative classification, and decided which ward appeared suitable. That decision might be based on behaviour observed during a short interview, information supplied by relatives, previous medical records, or the availability of space. Space often influenced the result as much as medical judgment. A patient might be placed wherever a bed was open, even when the ward was poorly suited to that person's needs. Someone experiencing depression could be housed near people in severe states of agitation. A person with an intellectual disability could share space with residents suffering from dementia, epilepsy, psychosis, or the lasting effects of physical injury. The institution's categories created an appearance of order, but overcrowding repeatedly broke down those divisions. Once the patient entered the ward, the door closed behind them. Locked doors served several purposes. They prevented residents from leaving without authorization. They allowed smaller numbers of attendants to control larger groups. They also reduced the risk that confused patients would wander into dangerous areas of the hospital grounds. The lock did not distinguish between protection and imprisonment. A person who had done nothing illegal could find that every exit required permission. Their movement depended on a schedule, an attendant, and the classification written in their record. A locked ward could be justified as a safety measure, but it also gave the institution nearly complete power over daily life. That power began with the body. Clothing in large public hospitals was practical and standardized. Individual garments were difficult to maintain when laundries processed material for thousands of residents. Some patients wore institutional clothing that was loose, worn, or poorly fitted. Shoes might be unavailable in the proper size. Personal appearance became less important than keeping the population covered as efficiently as possible. In the worst areas, even clothing was not guaranteed. Photographs and reports from the 1940s showed unclothed or partly clothed patients inside Byberry. Reformers documented nakedness not as an isolated medical necessity, but as part of the ordinary neglect found in overcrowded wards. Some residents removed their own clothing because of illness, confusion, heat, discomfort, or habit. Replacing it required employees to notice, intervene, and provide clean garments. When too few attendants watched too many people, patients could remain naked for long periods. The loss of clothing meant more than physical exposure. Clothing helps people maintain identity. A favourite shirt, a familiar coat, or even the simple act of choosing what to wear separates one person from another. Institutional garments removed much of that distinction. Nakedness removed it completely. A resident could become one more body in a room filled with bodies. The sleeping areas reinforced that feeling. Dormitories contained rows of beds placed close together. In periods of severe overcrowding, there was little space between them and little opportunity for privacy. A patient could hear strangers breathing, talking, crying, coughing, or moving throughout the night. Sleep depended on the condition of everyone nearby. Someone might shout for hours. Another patient might walk between the beds. A confused resident could climb into the wrong place. An attendant might switch on lights to handle an emergency. Doors opened and closed. Metal frames moved against the floor. The ward continued operating even when most people were expected to sleep. Beds also created practical risks. Personal property could be taken. Arguments began over small objects or space. A frightened patient had no private room to retreat into. Someone recovering from an attack might sleep only a few feet from the person responsible. The institution could separate patients after serious incidents, but separation required another available room. Byberry rarely had enough space. Morning began according to hospital routine rather than individual preference. Attendants moved through the dormitory, woke residents, and prepared them for washing, dressing, medication, and breakfast. A patient who moved too slowly could delay the schedule. Someone refusing to rise might be treated as uncooperative, even when the refusal came from depression, fear, physical pain, or confusion. Washing was another collective process. Bathrooms had to serve large numbers of people. Patients who could care for themselves used shared facilities under institutional rules. Others needed assistance. Residents with severe disabilities might require attendants to wash them, change their clothing, and clean their beds. The work was demanding and unpleasant. It also required time. In the areas described by conscientious objectors during the Second World War, that time was often unavailable. Ward A, which employees called the incontinent ward, housed people who could not consistently control their bodily functions. The ward lacked sufficient activities, therapy, and proper furniture. Patients suffered from sores and were left sitting against or moving across floors that had not been adequately cleaned. Workers reported that the smell remained in their clothing long after they left. The conditions were not caused by mental illness alone. A psychiatric diagnosis did not make clean floors impossible. Intellectual disability did not prevent the state from providing clean clothing. Incontinence did not require a patient to develop untreated sores. Those conditions resulted from too many residents, too few workers, limited supplies, damaged facilities, and a system that accepted inadequate care as normal. The distinction matters because institutional reports often describe difficult patient behaviour without equally describing the environment producing it. A resident who resisted bathing might have experienced rough handling during previous baths. Someone who struck an attendant could be reacting to fear. A person who removed clothing might be overheated, uncomfortable, or unable to communicate a medical problem. The behaviour appeared in the record. The cause often did not. After washing came food. Byberry's kitchens prepared meals on an industrial scale. Thousands of portions had to be produced according to a fixed budget. Food needed to be inexpensive, easy to store, and simple enough to serve quickly. Meals could include porridge, bread, potatoes, vegetables, soup, and limited amounts of meat, depending on the period and available supplies. Hospital diets were sometimes calculated to meet minimum nutritional standards. Meeting a standard on paper did not ensure that every patient ate enough. Some residents could not feed themselves. Others ate slowly. A confused patient might knock food to the floor, refuse it, or attempt to take another person's portion. Attendants supervising a large room had limited ability to help each person individually. Meals, therefore, became another test of speed and obedience. A capable resident could eat what was provided and remain unnoticed. A person requiring assistance depended on whether someone had time. If the dining area needed to be cleared for the next group, unfinished food might be removed. Hunger could continue even inside a place responsible for feeding every resident. Patients who worked in kitchens or food service sometimes gained access to additional portions, leftovers, or preferred assignments. Such advantages formed part of Byberry's internal economy. A small privilege could matter greatly in an environment where almost every choice was controlled. Cigarettes also became important in many 20th century psychiatric institutions. Smoking was common among patients and employees, and cigarettes could serve as comfort, reward, currency, or a method of control. Access depended on hospital rules and staff discretion. A resident who followed instructions might receive one. Another could have smoking privileges removed. The object was small. The authority behind it was not. After breakfast, the day divided according to classification. Some patients joined work crews. Others attended limited occupational or recreational activities. A smaller number received medical treatment or interviews with physicians. Many remained in day rooms or ward spaces with little to do. Byberry's history contains repeated descriptions of idleness. Patients sat on benches, stood against walls, paced, or wandered around permitted areas. The Pennsylvania Department of Welfare's 1946 pictorial report and the photographs published by reformers showed crowded rooms marked by nakedness, inactivity, and lack of attention. Idleness could look harmless beside photographs of physical abuse. Its effects were slower. A person left without meaningful activity for months or years could lose the habit of making decisions. Conversation declined, practical skills weakened. Time became difficult to measure because one day resembled the next. A patient might begin by asking when they would go home and eventually stop asking. Hospital officials sometimes interpreted this passivity as a symptom of permanent illness. In reality, institutional life could produce it. The term total institution was later used by sociologist Irving Goffman to describe places where people slept, worked, and spent their free time under one authority, separated from the wider community. Byberry fit that pattern closely. Daily activities that normally occur in different places were compressed into the hospital's enclosed world. The same administration controlled housing, food, work, recreation, medical care, punishment, and access to the outside. There was little opportunity to step outside one role. A worker dissatisfied with a job could usually go home after a shift. A hospital patient assigned to a laundry or farm crew returned afterward to a ward controlled by the same institution. A resident angry with an attendant might encounter that person again at meals, medication time, or bedtime. Avoidance was difficult. Work assignments offered some relief. Patients maintained grounds, worked in kitchens and laundries, moved supplies, cleaned buildings, and assisted with agricultural tasks. A resident assigned outdoors might enjoy space, fresh air, and distance from the ward. Someone trusted with useful duties could gain a stronger sense of identity. Work could also become compulsory and exploitative. The institution depended on patient labour to operate at low cost. Jobs that might have required paid employees were performed by residents whose ability to refuse was limited. A person described as capable enough to work was not necessarily considered capable enough to leave. That contradiction was central to Byberry. Patients could be trusted with tools, food, laundry, animals, or maintenance tasks, while still being judged unable to manage any part of their own lives outside the grounds. Those who could not work remained more confined. People with severe physical disabilities, chronic illnesses, or intense psychiatric symptoms often received the least stimulation and the most restrictive care. Ward B, known to workers as the violent ward, showed how quickly restriction could turn into abuse. Patients there sometimes attacked one another. The danger was real. Attendants had to prevent injuries, separate fights, and respond to unpredictable behaviour. Staffing during the war could be as low as 1 to 4 attendants caring for approximately 350 patients during a shift. Under such conditions, careful individual supervision was impossible. The response frequently involved restraint. Patients were strapped to beds for hours. Restraints could be used to prevent immediate harm, but prolonged use created additional dangers. A restrained person could not use the bathroom independently, change position comfortably, defend themselves, or seek help. Tight straps could injure skin and restrict circulation. Extended immobility increased the risk of sores. Restraint altered the relationship between patients and employees. A frightened resident learned that resistance could lead to being tied down. An attendant learned that straps made the ward quieter. What began as an emergency measure could become a routine answer to behaviour the institution lacked the staff to manage in other ways. Violence provided an even faster answer. Conscientious objectors assigned to Byberry reported that some full-time attendants beat difficult patients with clubs, shortened broom handles, or rubber hoses filled with buckshot. These were not approved medical treatments. They were tools of intimidation and punishment used inside wards where witnesses often had little power to intervene. The violence did not need to happen to every patient to control the room. Residents watched. They heard blows and threats. They saw who was removed or tied down. Fear travelled through the ward faster than any official instruction. Some attendants may have viewed force as necessary self-protection. Working in an overcrowded psychiatric hospital could be dangerous. Employees were struck, bitten, scratched, and injured. A worker entering a fight between patients could be attacked by both. That danger did not justify punishment after a patient had been controlled. It did not justify striking people because they were slow, noisy, incontinent, or difficult to understand. The conscientious objectors demonstrated that different methods were possible. Their pacifist beliefs led many of them to avoid violence and reduce the use of physical restraint when they could. They used calm speech, physical separation, and non-violent control. Some reported that patients responded differently when they no longer expected to be beaten. The lesson was simple, but important. The ward was not violent only because violent people lived there. It was also violent because violence had become part of its management. Medical treatment occupied a complicated place within this environment. During Byberry's early decades, psychiatry had few reliable methods for treating severe mental illness. Doctors used sedatives, hydrotherapy, occupational activity, rest, isolation, and various physical procedures. Some treatments were attempts to relieve genuine suffering. Others were based on theories that later proved ineffective or harmful. Hydrotherapy could involve warm baths intended to calm agitation or cold water used to stimulate withdrawn patients. A continuous bath required equipment and supervision. In an overcrowded institution, water treatment could become restraint by another method, with a patient held or confined for extended periods. Sedating drugs reduced agitation but did not cure the underlying condition. Heavy sedation could leave residents unsteady, confused, or unable to participate in ordinary activities. During the 1930s and 1940s, psychiatric hospitals adopted more aggressive somatic treatments. Insulin coma therapy deliberately lowered blood sugar until a patient lost consciousness. Metrazole therapy produced seizures. Electroconvulsive therapy used electrical current to trigger a controlled seizure. Lobotomy severed or damaged connections in the frontal areas of the brain. These methods were introduced because doctors faced illnesses they could not otherwise control. Some patients did improve after electroconvulsive therapy, especially those with severe depression, and modern ECT remains a regulated treatment performed with anesthesia and muscle relaxation. Earlier use, however, often occurred under very different conditions. Patients could receive shock treatments without modern safeguards. Memory loss, fractures, confusion, and fear were possible. Consent standards were weak, especially for people already confined by court or medical authority. At a place like Byberry, treatment and institutional convenience could overlap. A procedure that reduced agitation might be considered successful because the patient caused fewer problems on the ward. That did not always mean the person experienced recovery. Lobotomy presented the most severe version of that conflict. The operation could leave a patient quieter and easier to manage, while also causing permanent changes in judgment, initiative, emotional response, and personality. In an overcrowded hospital, calm behaviour had administrative value. The question of what had been lost was hard to measure. Patients did not all experience these treatments, and the exact practices changed over Byberry's long history. Most daily life still consisted of routine custody, rather than dramatic medical procedures. Meals, waiting, work, medication, bathing, and sleep occupied far more time. That ordinary repetition made the institution difficult to describe. A single act of violence could be reported. A photograph could capture an overcrowded room. The slow erosion of identity occurred without a clear event. A patient stopped receiving letters. A family visited less often. A personal garment wore out and was replaced with institutional clothing. The patient's name was used less frequently than a nickname, diagnosis, or bed number. Years passed. Contact with the outside became harder to maintain. Visiting required relatives to travel to the distant campus during permitted hours. Families dealing with poverty, work, illness, or childcare could not always come regularly. Some were ashamed that a relative had been committed. Others believed doctors who advised them not to visit because it might upset the patient. A missed visit became several missed visits. Eventually, the institution became the patient's only social world. Letters could provide a connection, but not every patient could read or write. Some needed help from staff. Others had no reliable address outside. Correspondence might be delayed, lost, or restricted according to hospital policy. Residents who retained family contact had an important form of protection. A relative could notice injuries, changes in weight, missing clothing, or sudden fear. Someone without visitors was easier to neglect. Employees knew which patients had families who asked questions. Patients knew it too. Small alliances developed inside the wards. Residents shared food, watched belongings, provided warnings, and helped one another complete tasks. A more capable patient might assist someone who could not dress or eat alone. Friendships formed between people who had no one else. These relationships were rarely documented in official reports because they did not fit administrative categories. The records counted treatment and discharge. They did not count the number of times one patient protected another from ridicule, offered a cigarette, saved a place on a bench, or called an attendant when someone became ill. Survival depended on these small acts. It also depended on learning the ward's unwritten rules. Do not attract the attention of a cruel attendant. Do not leave food unguarded. Do not resist when resistance will only bring restraints. Know when the shift changes. Know which employee listens and which one does not. Know where to stand during an argument. The longer a person remained, the more valuable this knowledge became. It helped residents navigate Byberry, but it made the outside world increasingly unfamiliar. Life beyond the hospital required different skills: handling money, finding housing, preparing meals, using transportation, and making decisions without permission. Years inside could weaken all of them. Even patients considered medically improved might remain because they had nowhere suitable to go. Families could refuse or be unable to take them back. Community housing and outpatient support were limited. A person might no longer need a locked ward but still occupy a bed because discharge planning had failed. The hospital then became crowded, partly with people who did not need to remain there. Their continued presence reduced resources for new admissions, which created more crowding, which increased reliance on restraint and custody. Byberry's locked doors concealed a cycle. The institution damaged independence, then treated the resulting dependence as evidence that institutional care was necessary. Official inspections and public exposés brought periods of improvement. Buildings were cleaned, staff received instructions, new programs appeared, administrators announced reforms. Some patients benefited from employees who worked hard to make conditions better. The size of the hospital repeatedly overwhelmed those efforts. When public attention moved elsewhere, shortages returned. A repaired ward deteriorated, trained workers left. The patient population remained larger than the available care system could support. Life behind the doors was therefore not one unchanging experience. It varied by decade, building, staff member, diagnosis, race, sex, and level of family involvement. Some residents remembered humane employees and meaningful work. Others experienced neglect, assault, isolation, and fear. Both realities could exist on the same grounds. That complexity should not soften the central fact. Byberry placed thousands of vulnerable people in an institution that repeatedly failed to protect their basic dignity. The failures were documented by workers, journalists, state investigators, families, and eventually courts. They were not rumours invented after the hospital closed. The question was no longer whether the conditions existed. The question was how long public officials could continue explaining them as temporary. The photographs taken secretly during the war had shown crowded rooms and neglected bodies. National magazines had carried those images beyond Philadelphia. Reformers had described Byberry as evidence of a nationwide crisis in psychiatric care. Public outrage would now force administrators to defend what happened behind the locked doors, and the hospital's worst conditions would become part of a much larger argument over how the United States treated people it had removed from ordinary society. The evidence left Byberry in small pieces. A worker wrote down what he saw after his shift. Another described the use of restraints. Someone else carried information beyond the hospital grounds and placed it in the hands of a reform organisation. A camera was hidden beneath a jacket. 3 rolls of film were exposed inside rooms where photography was not supposed to occur. None of those actions closed the hospital. They did something that had proved almost as difficult. They made it harder for the public to look away. Byberry's conditions were not unknown to government officials before the national scandals of the 1940s. The hospital had already been investigated. Its overcrowding appeared in reports. Administrators knew that wards held more people than they had been designed to accommodate. Pennsylvania had taken control of the institution in 1938, after scandals involving Byberry and other locally managed facilities. The transfer to state authority was itself an admission that the existing system had failed. The public did not yet understand the daily result. Official language concealed much of it. Reports discussed capacity, appropriations, personnel, construction, classification, and patient movement. A document might state that the hospital needed additional attendants or that a building required renovation. It did not necessarily describe an unclothed person sitting for hours against a dirty wall. The gap between those two forms of description protected the institution. Officials could acknowledge overcrowding without requiring citizens to imagine what overcrowding looked like. They could discuss shortages without showing the people left unwashed because of them. They could promise new construction, while residents continued sleeping in rooms where beds were packed together with inadequate space between them. The conscientious objectors who arrived at Byberry during the Second World War entered that gap. Beginning in 1942, the American Friends Service Committee operated Civilian Public Service Camp 49 at the hospital. Over the next 4 years, 187 conscientious objectors worked there as attendants and orderlies. They had refused military service, often because of Quaker, Mennonite, Brethren, or other religious commitments to non-violence. Alternative service placed them in institutions where labour shortages had become severe because of the war. Many of them expected difficult work. They were not prepared for a system in which neglect had become routine. The men encountered patients living without sufficient clothing, activities, therapy, or furniture. They saw residents with sores. They worked in rooms where bodily waste remained on floors because too few employees were available to clean the space and care for the people occupying it. In the ward known as the violent ward, they saw patients restrained to beds for long periods. They also reported that some established attendants struck residents with clubs, shortened broom handles, and rubber hoses weighted with buckshot. The conscientious objectors were not neutral observers. Their religious beliefs shaped how they interpreted what they saw. They had chosen imprisonment or alternative labour rather than participate in war. The use of force against defenceless patients therefore carried particular meaning for them. They also discovered that violence was not always necessary to control the wards. Some attempted to manage residents through calm speech, physical separation, patience, and less punitive forms of restraint. These methods did not remove the danger from psychiatric work. Patients could still attack one another or injure employees. The objectors did not claim that every crisis could be solved through conversation. Their experience weakened the hospital's argument that brutality was simply unavoidable. When patients were treated with less fear and humiliation, some became less aggressive. When workers entered the ward without clubs, the room did not automatically collapse into chaos. The behaviour of residents was partly a response to illness, but it was also shaped by the environment in which they were confined. That conclusion threatened more than a few cruel attendants. It threatened the institution's explanation of itself. Byberry had long presented harsh conditions as the unfortunate consequence of caring for a difficult population. If residents were naked, officials could blame their behaviour. If wards were violent, the hospital could point to dangerous patients. If people remained restrained, administrators could describe the restraints as protection. The conscientious objectors redirected attention toward the system. Why were there so few attendants? Why were residents left without clothing? Why were restraints used for hours rather than minutes? Why did employees have access to weapons inside a hospital? Why had these practices continued after the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania assumed control? Written testimony could be denied. A superintendent could claim that a worker misunderstood what he saw. Officials could describe an account as emotional, exaggerated, or politically motivated. Photographs created a different problem. Charlie Lord, a Quaker conscientious objector assigned to Byberry, used a small camera concealed in his jacket to record conditions inside the hospital. He exposed 3 rolls of film. The images showed patients gathered in bare rooms, bodies without clothing, overcrowded sleeping areas, and the absence of the basic personal care the word hospital implied. The photographs were not polished. They did not need to be. Their force came from the fact that the people in them were not posing for an official report. They were living through an ordinary day. A government photographer visiting with permission could be directed toward a clean building, a work program, a recreation room, or a modern piece of medical equipment. A superintendent could arrange a tour that emphasized improvement. Employees could prepare wards before inspectors arrived. Lord's hidden camera recorded the areas the institution had reason to keep private. The men involved in the reform effort had to decide what to do with the images. Releasing them could expose conditions, but it could also expose patients at their most vulnerable. Many were unclothed. None had meaningfully consented to become public symbols of psychiatric neglect. That ethical problem was real. The patients had already lost control over where they lived, what they wore, and who could enter their rooms. Publication would take another decision out of their hands. At the same time, keeping the photographs private would protect the institution more than the people inside it. The reformers chose exposure. Their campaign developed through the National Mental Health Foundation, created by conscientious objectors and other reform advocates during the war. The organisation brought together workers from several public psychiatric hospitals, not only Byberry. They compared experiences and recognised that the conditions they had witnessed were part of a national pattern. State hospitals across the country had become overcrowded warehouses. Some institutions were better than others. Some had qualified superintendents, active treatment programs, and employees who attempted to provide humane care. The basic structure remained similar. Large numbers of people were confined far from public view, supported by inadequate budgets, and supervised by workers who often received little training. Byberry became one of the clearest examples, because the photographs were so difficult to dismiss. In 1944, the reform organisation began circulating information about conditions in mental hospitals. Eleanor Roosevelt expressed interest in the group's work. The following year, representatives arranged a meeting with her and showed her Lord's photographs. Roosevelt was familiar with social reform campaigns and with reports of poverty and institutional neglect. She had used her position as First Lady to support civil rights, labour reform, youth programs, and humanitarian causes. The images from Byberry still disturbed her. According to the later account preserved by the National Park Service, she initially assumed the photographs had been taken in a poor southern state. She was shocked to learn that the hospital stood in Philadelphia. That reaction revealed an assumption shared by many Americans. Severe institutional abuse was imagined as something belonging elsewhere. It might happen in a distant region, under an openly corrupt local government, or in a country without modern medical traditions. Philadelphia was one of the oldest and largest cities in the United States. Pennsylvania possessed universities, hospitals, medical schools, and a long history of reform movements. Byberry stood within that same city. The scandal was not the result of ignorance alone. It existed beside medical knowledge, political authority, and public wealth. Roosevelt's support gave the reformers access to a broader audience. She could not order Pennsylvania to rebuild the hospital, but her attention made it more difficult to treat the objectors as troublesome employees. Their testimony now had a nationally recognised advocate. The photographs reached the public in 1946. On May 6th of that year, Life magazine published an investigation titled Bedlam 1946. Most US mental hospitals are a shame and a disgrace. The article examined Byberry and Cleveland State Hospital in Ohio. It showed American readers images of naked, crowded, inactive and restrained patients inside state institutions. The timing gave the photographs additional force. The Second World War had ended less than a year earlier. American soldiers and civilians had seen images from liberated Nazi concentration camps. Newspapers, magazines and newsreels had shown bodies, overcrowded barracks, starvation, and people stripped of dignity by institutions built around confinement. The photographs from American mental hospitals did not document the same political system or the same program of organized mass murder. The situations were not equivalent. The visual resemblance was still immediate. Readers saw unclothed people gathered against walls. They saw overcrowded rooms. They saw bodies restrained and neglected. The fact that these images came from public hospitals operated by American states created a moral crisis. The United States had presented the war as a defense of freedom and human worth. Now a national magazine showed people confined in conditions that contradicted those claims. The article's title used the word Bedlam, the popular name of Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London. For centuries, Bethlehem had represented the worst public image of the asylum: noise, confinement, spectacle, and degradation. Calling Byberry part of a modern American Bedlam placed it within that history. It also suggested that progress had been overstated. Psychiatric institutions had changed their names repeatedly. Asylums became hospitals. Keepers became attendants. Inmates became patients. Custody was described as treatment. The photographs showed that new language had not guaranteed new conditions. At Byberry, beds were crowded so closely that clear passageways could be obstructed. Patients lived without clothes. Residents remained in rooms with almost no activity or exercise. These images appeared with direct captions emphasizing nakedness, idleness, and crowding. Readers could no longer interpret overcrowding as a harmless number. The image of tightly arranged beds raised the risk of fire. If smoke filled a dormitory, patients would need to be moved quickly. Locked doors, narrow passageways, and rows of beds could turn an emergency into a mass casualty event. The image of a naked resident raised questions about staffing, clothing, heat, sanitation, and human dignity. The image of people sitting without activity raised another question. What treatment were they receiving? Byberry was officially a state hospital. Its residents were called patients. Yet many spent their days in conditions that looked less like medicine than detention. Public reaction was strong, but outrage did not produce one clear solution. Some demanded larger budgets and better employees. Others argued for stricter inspections. Reformers called for professional training, more nurses, improved medical services, and an end to routine violence. State authorities defended improvements already underway and warned that the photographs showed the worst wards rather than the entire hospital. That defence was factually possible and morally weak. Byberry did contain areas that were cleaner and better organised. Some patients worked outdoors, attended activities, or received attention from conscientious employees. Newer buildings offered better conditions than the oldest wards. A public hospital was responsible for every person it confined. It could not justify an abusive building by pointing to a humane one elsewhere on the grounds. Pennsylvania's own Department of Welfare produced a pictorial report on the state's mental institutions in 1946. Images associated with that report also documented unhealthy conditions, including overcrowding, nakedness, apathy, and lack of attention at Byberry. The official material confirmed that the reformers had not invented the problem. The argument shifted from whether conditions were bad to why they had become bad. Hospital administrators pointed to low appropriations. State legislators had not provided enough money to hire and retain trained staff. Wartime labour shortages had made an existing problem worse. Buildings were old, supplies were limited. The patient population included people with severe disabilities and medical needs. Each explanation was valid. Together they described a state institution that could not perform its assigned purpose. The public wanted individual villains because they were easier to understand. A cruel attendant could be fired. A negligent supervisor could be replaced. A superintendent could resign. Byberry's failures survived changes in personnel because they were structural. The hospital admitted more people than it could properly house. It relied on low-paid workers to maintain order inside crowded wards. It offered limited alternatives to restraint. It served families and public agencies that had nowhere else to send people. Closing one building would simply move its residents into another. The scandal therefore exposed a problem larger than Byberry. State hospitals had become the primary American response to severe mental illness, intellectual disability, dementia, and many forms of social dependency. They held people whom families could not support and communities did not want to see. The hospitals were expected to provide treatment. They were funded to provide custody. Albert Q. Deutsch became one of the journalists who brought this contradiction into public debate. Deutsch had investigated social welfare systems and psychiatric institutions. He visited hospitals, interviewed workers, examined records, and described conditions in language designed to provoke reform. His 1948 book, The Shame of the States, presented Byberry as one of the country's most disturbing mental institutions. He called it Philadelphia's Bedlam, and compared conditions in American state hospitals to scenes associated with concentration camps. His account included photographs and descriptions of the male incontinent ward and other neglected areas. Deutsch's comparison was intentionally severe. He wanted readers to understand that cruelty did not need to be officially declared as policy. It could emerge when a government confined people, spent too little on their care, tolerated violence, and allowed the public to forget them. The book's title assigned responsibility directly. This was not described as the shame of one superintendent, one attendant, or one hospital. It was the shame of the states. State governments operated the institutions. Legislatures controlled budgets. Courts and public doctors authorized commitments. Citizens elected the officials responsible for those systems. Byberry's scandal belonged to the public, even to people who had never entered the grounds. Out of Sight, Out of Mind, published by the National Mental Health Foundation in 1947, made a similar argument. The title explained how the system sustained itself. Once people entered a distant institution, they disappeared from neighbourhood life. Families could visit, but the wider public rarely saw the wards. The absence of patients from public spaces reduced pressure to provide community support. Their invisibility became a political advantage. A road needed repair because drivers complained. A school needed funding because parents organised. The psychiatric ward could remain filthy because many residents could not vote, write letters, contact newspapers, or persuade officials to act. The people most affected possessed the least influence over reform. The conscientious objectors and journalists acted as witnesses, but their work created an uncomfortable dependency. Patients needed outsiders to confirm that their suffering was real. Their own testimony was often dismissed as unreliable because they were mentally ill. This was one of the institution's strongest defences. A resident who claimed an attendant had struck them could be described as confused or delusional. A person who resisted restraint could be classified as violent. Someone who shouted about mistreatment could be sedated for agitation. The hospital controlled the language used to interpret every complaint. Photographs interrupted that control because they allowed viewers to see a condition without first accepting the institution's explanation. They did not tell the entire story. A photograph cannot reveal how long a person has been sitting in a room, or what happened immediately before the shutter opened. It cannot show whether an employee returned minutes later with clean clothes. It cannot establish how every ward functioned. The images did not need to prove that every moment at Byberry was abusive. They proved that the documented moments were possible inside a hospital operating under state authority. The resulting pressure produced changes. Public attention encouraged states to increase funding, improve inspections, hire additional employees, and modernize facilities. mental health reform organisations expanded. Professional groups called for better training. The federal government became more involved in psychiatric research and mental health policy. In 1946, President Harry Truman signed the National Mental Health Act, which supported research, training, and the creation of what became the National Institute of Mental Health. The national development was not caused by Byberry alone, but the hospital scandals contributed to the sense that the United States needed a different approach. The immediate reforms remained limited by the size of the institutions. Byberry's population had reached approximately 6,100 by 1947. The average annual expenditure was reported as only $346 per patient. That amount had to cover food, housing, clothing, maintenance, staffing, and medical care. No training program could compensate for those numbers. An attendant could become more skilled and still remain responsible for too many residents. A renovated bathroom could become filthy when hundreds of people used it without adequate cleaning staff. A new recreation program could reach only part of the population. Pennsylvania continued building. New structures were offered as evidence that the state had responded. Additional capacity reduced crowding temporarily. Improved kitchens, medical spaces, and patient buildings offered real benefits. The institution's population filled the available space. Expansion preserved the system the scandal had exposed. The public had seen that Byberry was failing, but the state still needed somewhere to send people. Community mental health services remained small. Effective psychiatric medications were not yet widely available. Families still received little assistance with home care. Private hospitals remained unaffordable for most people. The hospital could not be emptied by public disgust alone. This created a repeated pattern. An investigation revealed abuse. Officials promised correction. Money was allocated, a ward improved, public attention declined, overcrowding and staff turnover weakened the changes. Another scandal followed. Byberry's reputation became progressively darker because every new revelation carried the weight of earlier promises. The state could no longer claim that it had just discovered the problem. By the late 1940s, the institution's conditions had been photographed, published nationally, described in books, and confirmed in official reports. Neglect after that point was not hidden ignorance. It was continued failure after warning. The scandals also encouraged doctors and officials to search for treatments that could reduce the institutional population. New procedures promised to make highly disturbed patients calmer. Lobotomy appeared to some psychiatrists as a way to transform crowded wards by reducing agitation. Electroconvulsive therapy became more common. Later, antipsychotic drugs would offer the possibility of controlling symptoms outside the hospital. The desire for treatment was genuine. So was the desire for easier management. A therapy that allowed a person to return home would be considered a medical success. A procedure that made a patient silent and compliant could also be described as improvement, even if the person never left Byberry. The scandal had shown America what the warehouses looked like. It had not yet settled what should replace them. That unresolved question followed the hospital into the 1950s and beyond. Physicians received new tools. Administrators gained new buildings. Reformers continued visiting and writing. The patient population eventually began to decline. Behind those developments remained the same pressure that had shaped Byberry from the beginning. Too many people in need, too little community support, and an institution expected to solve problems far beyond the reach of medicine. The next changes would be introduced as scientific progress. Some would bring real relief, others would leave permanent damage. All of them would enter wards where the difference between helping a patient and making that patient easier to control had never been clearly protected. The doctors who entered Byberry after the scandals of the 1940s inherited a problem that medicine had not created by itself and could not solve by itself. The hospital held thousands of people with very different needs. Some experienced hallucinations, delusions, severe depression, or periods of extreme agitation. Others had intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, dementia, brain injuries, or chronic physical illnesses. Many had been living inside institutions for years. Some no longer had families willing or able to receive them. Others might have returned home if housing, income, outpatient care and practical support had existed. Those distinctions were difficult to preserve inside an overcrowded state hospital. A doctor might recognise that one patient needed psychotherapy, another needed neurological care, and a third mainly needed a safe place to live. The hospital still had to assign each person to a ward, fit them into a routine, and manage their behaviour with the employees available. This was the central difficulty facing psychiatric medicine in the middle of the 20th century. Doctors were being asked to treat illness inside institutions designed primarily to contain large populations. Byberry's record of neglect created pressure for a medical transformation. Journalists and reformers had shown that custody without treatment produced overcrowding, violence, inactivity, and dependence. State officials could no longer defend the hospital as a simple shelter. If Byberry called itself a hospital, it had to offer something that could be recognised as medicine. New buildings, laboratories, training programs, and treatment facilities were presented as evidence that the institution was changing. The change was real, but it was not simple. Psychiatry before the 1950s had few reliable ways to reduce the severe symptoms of schizophrenia, mania, or other psychotic illnesses. Doctors could provide rest, food, observation, structured activity, and a protected environment. They could use sedatives to make a patient sleep or become less active. They could attempt psychotherapy with people able and willing to participate. For patients experiencing constant hallucinations, intense paranoia, or uncontrollable agitation, those methods often brought limited relief. The absence of effective treatment created desperation among physicians as well as patients and families. A doctor might watch a person strike their head against a wall, refuse food because they believed it was poisoned, or remain almost completely withdrawn for months. Even a dangerous treatment could appear reasonable when the alternative seemed to be lifelong confinement. This environment produced a series of physical therapies that attempted to change the mind by acting directly on the body. One of them was insulin coma therapy. The procedure was developed in Europe during the 1930s and used mainly for people diagnosed with schizophrenia. A patient received increasing doses of insulin until the blood sugar level fell dangerously low. The patient became confused, lost consciousness, and entered a coma. Medical staff later reversed the process by providing glucose. A full course could involve repeated comas over weeks or months. The treatment required careful observation because the risks were obvious. A patient could suffer prolonged unconsciousness, brain injury, seizures, or death. Even when the procedure went according to plan, it placed the body under severe stress. Doctors continued using it because some reported improvement. Patients occasionally became calmer or appeared less psychotic after treatment. Hospitals also valued the structured medical activity surrounding the procedure. Insulin units required doctors, nurses, equipment, and careful schedules. They looked like active treatment rather than custodial waiting. Later research failed to establish insulin coma therapy as an effective treatment for schizophrenia. Its use declined after safer and more useful psychiatric drugs became available. At the time, however, many physicians believed they were practicing modern medicine. That belief is important. Harmful treatment did not always begin with the desire to punish. It could begin with confidence, limited evidence, professional pressure, and the need to offer hope where little existed. Metrazole convulsive therapy followed a related idea. Doctors administered a drug that caused a sudden seizure. The experience could be terrifying. Patients often remained conscious long enough to feel intense fear before losing control of their bodies. Seizures could result in fractures, dislocations, and other injuries. The theory behind the treatment was uncertain, but psychiatry had begun to believe that induced seizures might relieve certain forms of mental illness. Electroconvulsive therapy provided a more controllable way to produce them. ECT used an electrical current applied through electrodes placed on the head. The current triggered a seizure. Early procedures were performed without the anesthesia, oxygen monitoring, and muscle-relaxing medication used in modern treatment. The patient's body could convulse violently, sometimes causing broken bones or injuries to the jaw and spine. Memory loss was common. Confusion could continue after treatment. Some patients remembered the procedure as deeply frightening. ECT was also one of the few physical treatments from that period that demonstrated genuine medical value. It proved especially effective for some people with severe depression, including patients who had stopped eating, become immobile, or faced immediate danger of suicide. It could also help certain cases of mania and catatonia. Modern ECT remains in use under controlled medical conditions because it can relieve symptoms that do not respond to other methods. The existence of real benefit does not erase the way it could be used inside institutions such as Byberry. Consent was weak or absent. A committed patient had little power to refuse. Treatment decisions were controlled by doctors and administrators, while families might be told only that a procedure was medically necessary. ECT could be administered because a patient was severely ill. It could also be used because a patient was disruptive, resistant, or difficult to manage. Those motives could overlap. When a treatment reduced agitation, the ward became quieter. A doctor might interpret that as psychiatric improvement. An attendant might simply be relieved that the patient required less supervision. The patient's own account of the experience carried less authority than the staff's observation of changed behaviour. The difference between recovery and obedience was not always examined closely. The most permanent physical treatment was lobotomy. The procedure involved cutting or damaging connections in the frontal regions of the brain. Its supporters believed that disturbing emotions, obsessions, aggression, and psychotic symptoms might be reduced by interrupting pathways associated with those conditions. American neurologist Walter Freeman became the country's best-known promoter of lobotomy. He argued that the operation could help patients who had failed to respond to other treatments and might otherwise spend the rest of their lives in institutions. Some patients did become less distressed or less violent. Others died from the procedure or developed seizures, infections, incontinence, severe cognitive impairment, emotional dullness, and major changes in personality. A person who had once been frightened, angry, or difficult might become passive and dependent. Hospitals could describe that passivity as improvement. A patient who no longer shouted, resisted, or attempted to escape required fewer employees to supervise. The procedure could make the institution easier to operate even when it did not restore the patient's ability to live independently. That possibility made lobotomy especially dangerous within an overcrowded system. The physician's aim might be medical. The hospital's need was administrative. Both could favour the same result for different reasons. Byberry was part of the national psychiatric system in which these treatments spread. Its surviving records include materials related to operations, medical services, and treatment, while its post-war expansion included facilities intended for active therapy and staff training. Pennsylvania's archival guide shows that the hospital maintained extensive clinical and administrative records as it moved from minimal custodial care toward a more medical model. Construction became part of this attempt to modernize the institution. In the late 1940s, work began on an active therapy building with dormitories, laboratories, an auditorium, a staff library, training facilities, and improved medical spaces. Support from the Philadelphia pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline & French connected Byberry's development to the rapidly changing field of psychiatric medication. The company would later market chlorpromazine in the United States under the brand name Thorazine. The new building represented a different idea of what Byberry could become. Instead of merely feeding and supervising patients, the hospital would examine them, study illness, train employees, and provide organised treatment. Modern equipment would replace the image of bare wards and idle residents. Medical professionals would replace the old model of untrained custodial attendants. The buildings offered genuine improvements. Better laboratories allowed more careful medical investigation. Training facilities could improve staff preparation. Modern medical and surgical services helped patients whose physical illnesses had often been neglected. The institution still held thousands of people. A modern room could treat only the patients who reached it. A staff training program could not immediately replace years of ward culture. New buildings required more nurses, doctors, attendants, technicians, maintenance workers, and public money. Byberry expanded its medical facilities while continuing to operate as a large custodial city. The greatest change came not from a building or an operation, but from a drug. Chlorpromazine was developed in France and entered psychiatric use in the early 1950s. It was not designed originally as a cure for schizophrenia. Researchers noticed that it produced a calming effect without simply rendering patients unconscious. That distinction was significant. Older sedatives could make an agitated person sleep, but the symptoms returned when the medication wore off. Chlorpromazine reduced hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and severe agitation in many patients while allowing them to remain awake. The change inside psychiatric hospitals was visible. People who had required restraint could sometimes move safely around the ward. Patients who had been unable to participate in conversation became easier to approach. Some could dress, eat, work, and attend activities with less supervision. Others became stable enough to leave the hospital. Mental health professionals described the transformation as revolutionary. State systems that had watched their patient populations rise for decades began reporting reduced use of seclusion and restraint after antipsychotic drugs became widely available. Federal psychiatric research programs expanded the large-scale testing of chlorpromazine and other compounds during the 1950s. For Byberry, the drug appeared to offer what decades of construction had not. It created the possibility that the hospital population could shrink. Thorazine did not cure schizophrenia. It controlled symptoms. Patients needed continued treatment, and the medication did not work equally well for everyone. People who had spent decades institutionalized could remain withdrawn and dependent even after hallucinations or agitation decreased. The drug also produced serious side effects. Patients could experience heavy sedation, muscle stiffness, tremors, restlessness, slowed movement, low blood pressure, dry mouth, constipation, and changes in body temperature. Long-term use could cause tardive dyskinesia, a condition involving involuntary movements that sometimes became permanent. Inside a hospital, sedation could again be interpreted as success. A heavily medicated patient might sit quietly for hours. The ward became easier to control. The person might also feel slowed, exhausted, emotionally distant, or physically uncomfortable. The term chemical restraint emerged to describe medication used mainly to restrict behavior, rather than to provide appropriate treatment. The problem was not the existence of antipsychotic drugs. For many patients, those medications brought the first meaningful relief they had experienced. The problem was the power of the institution to decide the dose, purpose, and duration with limited patient involvement. Medicine had acquired a tool capable of reducing suffering. The same tool could reduce resistance. Doctors now faced a responsibility that earlier generations had not encountered. They needed to determine whether medication was helping a person live more fully or merely helping the institution operate more quietly. That judgment required time, careful observation, and communication with the patient. Byberry remained short of all three. The new drugs nevertheless changed the direction of American mental health policy. State hospital populations began declining during the second half of the 1950s. Patients experiencing a first psychotic episode could receive medication, stabilize, and leave after months rather than remain for years. Long-term residents could be considered for discharge when their behavior became manageable. The idea of lifelong institutionalization began to weaken. At the same time, criticism of large state hospitals continued to grow. Sociologists described how total institutions stripped people of identity and independence. Civil liberties advocates challenged indefinite confinement. Families demanded alternatives. Government officials saw that community care might cost less than maintaining enormous campuses. Several different interests moved toward the same policy. Reformers wanted patients freed from abusive institutions. Doctors believed medication made outpatient treatment possible. Fiscal officials wanted to reduce expensive state hospital systems. Civil rights advocates questioned involuntary confinement without strong legal protections. The result became known as deinstitutionalization. The word suggests a single decision to empty hospitals. In reality, it described several changes unfolding over decades. Fewer people were admitted for long stays. Existing patients were discharged. Courts made involuntary commitment more difficult. Federal policy encouraged community mental health services. Disability benefits, nursing homes and other programs received people who might once have remained in state hospitals. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which authorized federal support for local centers intended to provide prevention, early treatment, outpatient care, emergency services and rehabilitation. The policy promised to replace isolated institutions with treatment near a patient's home. For someone at Byberry, the idea was straightforward. A psychiatric crisis would no longer automatically lead to years behind locked doors. A local centre could provide medication, counselling, day programmes, crisis care, and support for families. Hospitalisation would become brief and focused on acute treatment. That complete system was never built on the scale required. Community centres opened unevenly. Some provided valuable services. Many areas received too little funding, too few employees, or no comprehensive centre at all. Federal construction support did not guarantee enough money for long-term operation. State governments reduced hospital populations faster than community programs expanded. Patients left institutions that had failed them and entered communities that were often unprepared to support them. Some returned successfully to relatives, found housing, continued medication, and built lives that would have been impossible under the lifelong confinement. Others moved into nursing homes, boarding houses, single-room hotels, shelters, or unstable living arrangements. Some stopped taking medication because of side effects, lack of follow-up care, or difficulty obtaining prescriptions. A person discharged with a bottle of pills still needed money, food, transportation, housing, and someone able to recognise a returning crisis. The absence of those supports did not prove that institutionalisation had been better. It proved that opening a locked door was not the same as creating a functioning mental health system. Byberry's population declined, but the hospital did not become small or simple. Long-term residents remained, including people with severe disabilities and little community support. The patients easiest to discharge were often those with stable families, manageable symptoms and practical living skills. Those left behind tended to require the most care. This changed the character of the hospital. Its total population fell, yet the needs of the remaining residents could be more concentrated. Wards still required trained employees, active treatment, and careful supervision. Funding did not always account for that change. As state institutions lost patients, political leaders could question why large budgets and campuses were still necessary. Buildings deteriorated. Hiring became difficult. Employees heard repeated rumours of closure. Programs expanded and contracted according to changing administrations. The same policy intended to end institutional neglect could produce new neglect inside institutions waiting to close. Doctors working at Byberry during these years occupied an uncertain position. Some believed deeply in the new medications and community model. They had seen patients improve and leave. Others worried that people were being discharged because the state wanted empty beds, rather than because stable services awaited them outside. Both concerns were justified. Treatment had changed enough to make the old hospital model indefensible. The replacement remained incomplete. The profession itself was also changing. Psychiatry placed greater emphasis on diagnosis, medication, research, and shorter hospital stays. Psychologists, social workers, occupational therapists, and rehabilitation specialists became more important in treatment planning. Nurses received expanded psychiatric training. These developments moved care away from the old system in which attendants maintained order while doctors appeared briefly. Progress depended on staffing. A treatment team could only function when enough professionals were employed and when each had time to understand individual patients. At Byberry, chronic shortages and institutional scale repeatedly reduced ambitious programs to limited services. Medication distribution could be completed quickly. Psychotherapy could not. A pill could be given to hundreds of patients according to schedule. Finding safe housing for one person might take weeks. The structure of the hospital still favoured interventions that were easy to administer across large populations. By the 1970s, Byberry had passed through nearly every major phase of 20th century psychiatric treatment. It had begun as a custodial farm. It had used work, restraint, sedation, hydrotherapy, convulsive treatments, surgery, and modern psychiatric drugs. It had adopted the language of rehabilitation and community care. None of those methods erased the institution's original problem. Byberry remained the place responsible for people other systems had failed to support. A doctor could reduce hallucinations but could not create an affordable apartment. A nurse could prepare a patient for discharge but could not force a community clinic to accept the case. A social worker could contact a family but could not repair decades of separation. Medical progress made freedom possible for many residents. It also allowed governments to claim that medication had solved problems that were social, economic, and political as well as medical. The doctors had tried to change everything because almost everything needed to change. Some introduced treatments that harmed patients in the name of progress. Others helped people regain control over symptoms that had dominated their lives. Often the same treatment could relieve one person and disable another. The same medication could support recovery at a careful dose and function as restraint at an excessive one. Byberry's history does not provide a clean division between cruel medicine and humane medicine. It shows what happens when medical decisions occur inside a system that values order, economy, and reduced staffing. The hospital population was falling, but the institution's reputation had not recovered. Older buildings remained in use. Reports of abuse continued. Mechanical restraint, seclusion, and heavy medication did not disappear with the arrival of modern psychiatry. The language changed from custody to treatment, and from institutionalization to rehabilitation. Patients still depended on the person holding the keys. As Byberry moved through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the question was no longer whether the old state hospital model would survive indefinitely. Hospitals across the country were closing or shrinking. Public policy had already decided that people should live in the community whenever possible. The remaining question was what would happen to an aging institution that had lost its purpose without escaping its failures. Byberry entered its final years with fewer patients, deteriorating buildings, unstable staffing, and repeated allegations that the treatments intended to replace physical force had become new methods of control. The hospital that had once expanded because too many people arrived would now begin the much slower process of deciding how everyone could leave. By the 1970s, Byberry no longer held the enormous population that had filled its wards after the Second World War. The rise of psychiatric medication, changing commitment laws, and the movement toward community treatment had reduced the number of people living in state hospitals across the United States. A smaller population should have made the hospital easier to operate. At Byberry it did not. The institution had been built over many decades for a system that was already disappearing. Its campus contained old dormitories, medical buildings, workshops, kitchens, tunnels, utility structures, offices and roads spread across a large section of northeast Philadelphia. Fewer patients remained, but the state still had to heat, repair, clean, secure, and staff much of that physical plant. The population fell faster than the campus could shrink. Empty beds appeared in buildings that still required maintenance. Wards could be consolidated, but moving patients did not erase the cost of the structures they left behind. Roofs continued to leak. Pipes continued to age. Heating systems needed fuel. Broken windows and damaged walls still required attention. A hospital designed to operate like a city was entering a period when much of that city was no longer needed. The people who remained were often those with the greatest difficulties. Many patients who could live with relatives, manage medication, or function in supported housing had already left. Those still inside Byberry were more likely to have severe psychiatric symptoms, intellectual or physical disabilities, long histories of institutionalization, or no dependable place to go. A falling census did not mean that the work became proportionally easier. A ward containing 50 relatively independent patients might require less assistance than a ward containing 20 people who needed help eating, dressing, bathing, and controlling dangerous behaviour. Byberry could report a lower population, while staff members still faced demanding conditions. The state also had less reason to invest in the hospital's future. Public policy had turned against large institutions. New construction was difficult to justify when officials expected the number of residents to keep declining. Repairs could be postponed because a building might soon be closed. Hiring permanent staff became harder when applicants believed the hospital had no long-term future. Rumours of closure circulated for years. Employees heard that their wards might be eliminated. Patients heard that they might be transferred. Families heard conflicting accounts about where their relatives would go. Administrators prepared plans that changed with budgets and political leadership. Uncertainty became part of the institution. This affected morale in ways that were difficult to measure. An employee working in a hospital expected to close might become less willing to build a career there. Experienced workers could seek more secure jobs elsewhere. Vacancies were filled with temporary or less experienced staff. Training a new employee required time from the people who remained. Patients noticed the changes. A familiar attendant disappeared. A ward was combined with another. A recreation program ended because an employee left. A doctor's assignment changed. Residents who depended on predictable routines faced repeated disruptions. For someone who had lived at Byberry for decades, even an improvement could be frightening if it arrived as an unexplained change. The hospital's decline did not occur quietly. Legal challenges began forcing Pennsylvania to answer for practices that institutions had once treated as internal matters. One important case involved patients who performed labour while confined at Byberry. Elvira Vecchione and Walter Bures brought a class action against Pennsylvania officials, challenging the hospital's failure to pay patients properly for work. The litigation resulted in orders and a consent decree requiring compensation, and the dispute continued into the 1970s when state officials attempted to escape parts of the agreement. In 1977, the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit upheld the refusal to set the decree aside. The case addressed money, but its importance was broader. Byberry had relied on patient labour since its earliest years. Residents worked in laundries, kitchens, maintenance crews, farms, and other institutional operations. Administrators could describe these duties as therapeutic activity. The hospital also benefited financially from work performed by people who had little power to negotiate wages or refuse assignments. The lawsuit forced the state to confront patients as workers with legal claims, not simply as recipients of care. That change reflected a wider transformation in disability law and mental health policy. Courts increasingly recognized that commitment to a hospital did not erase every constitutional right. A diagnosis did not give the state unlimited authority over a person's body, labour, communication, or living conditions. Byberry had developed during an era when institutional administrators possessed broad discretion. Its final decades unfolded during an era when that discretion was being challenged. Lawyers and advocates questioned the use of seclusion and mechanical restraint. They examined involuntary medication. They demanded treatment plans and discharge efforts. They argued that patients should live in the least restrictive environment appropriate to their needs. Each demand changed the meaning of the locked ward. An institution could no longer defend a practice simply by saying that doctors considered it necessary. Officials increasingly had to document why the practice was used, how long it continued, and whether less restrictive alternatives had been attempted. Byberry struggled to meet those expectations. Its problems were no longer limited to the famous photographs of the 1940s. Reports continued to describe unexpected deaths, mistreatment, and extensive use of seclusion and restraints. Despite the falling population, the hospital's reputation remained tied to neglect and control. By the late 1980s, it was widely regarded as a clinical and management failure, even though only about 500 patients remained. The number is important because it removes one of the institution's oldest defences. Byberry could no longer claim that 6,000 people had made humane care impossible. The census had fallen by more than 90% from its post-war peak. Serious problems continued. This suggested that overcrowding had never been the only cause. The hospital's culture mattered. Its buildings mattered. Staff training, supervision, accountability, and leadership mattered. Practices developed during decades of crowding could remain in place after the crowds disappeared. An attendant who had learned to use restraint as the fastest response did not automatically abandon that method, because fewer patients occupied the ward. A supervisor accustomed to explaining injuries as accidents did not necessarily become more transparent. A building designed for mass custody did not become therapeutic because several rooms were empty. The institution carried its history forward. During the 1980s, several incidents intensified scrutiny. Reports described negligence, patient abuse, questionable deaths, and excessive reliance on chemical and mechanical restraints and seclusion. Investigations were ordered under Governor Richard Thornburgh and continued as Pennsylvania reconsidered whether the hospital could be repaired at all. A state-appointed Blue Ribbon Committee was established in 1987 to examine Byberry's operation, treatment practices, and allegations of abuse. The investigators faced a question that had followed the hospital for decades. Could Byberry be improved, or had the institution itself become the problem? Closing a building because its roof leaked was straightforward. Closing a hospital containing hundreds of vulnerable residents was not. Every patient needed an individual plan. Some could move to group homes or supervised apartments, others required nursing care, intensive psychiatric services, or secure treatment. A person who had lived inside Byberry for 30 years might need to relearn tasks that the institution had always performed for them. Another patient might resist leaving because the hospital, despite all its failures, was the only familiar home they remembered. Closure advocates argued that these difficulties did not justify keeping an abusive institution open. Employees and some families worried that community care existed more clearly in policy documents than in reality. Both sides could point to earlier failures of deinstitutionalization. People had already been discharged from state hospitals without adequate housing, clinical follow-up, or financial support. Some had entered unstable boarding homes. Some became homeless. Others moved through emergency rooms, shelters, and jails. A badly managed institution was unacceptable. A discharge to neglect outside the walls was not a humane solution. When Governor Robert P. Casey announced the decision to close Byberry in December 1987, he addressed that concern directly. He described the hospital as little more than a warehouse, and said its patients could not simply be placed on the streets. The plan called for the facility to be phased out over 2 years, with its approximately 525 residents provided with other care and living arrangements. The announcement produced relief among many advocates. Byberry had survived investigations, scandals, lawsuits, new administrators, new treatments, and decades of promises. Reform repeatedly changed parts of the hospital without changing what the institution represented. Now the state had accepted that repair was no longer enough. The decision did not immediately unlock every door. closure required assessments, funding, negotiations with families, development of community services, transfers to other hospitals, and arrangements with private non-profit providers. Staff members needed to be reassigned or dismissed. Medical records had to follow patients. Medication supplies and treatment plans had to continue during every move. The hospital began to contract building by building. Wards closed as their residents left. Remaining patients were brought together in fewer areas. Buildings that had once contained constant movement became quiet. The process changed the sound of the campus. A laundry that had served thousands handled less material. Kitchen operations diminished. Corridors that once carried food carts, attendants, and work crews emptied. Lights were turned off in sections no longer occupied. A closed ward did not become harmless the moment its patients left. Furniture, files, clothing, equipment, and waste could remain behind. Doors were secured, but a campus as large as Byberry was difficult to protect completely. Maintenance workers still entered abandoned buildings. Security staff watched areas that were no longer part of patient care but still belonged to the state. For employees, each closure carried mixed meaning. Some had spent years advocating better care and supported the decision. Others believed the hospital was being condemned for problems created by politicians who had denied it resources. Long-term workers had built friendships, routines, and professional identities inside Byberry. Closure meant that their jobs and community were disappearing along with the institution. The hospital's staff included people who had abused patients. It also included people who had cared for residents under difficult conditions for decades. A complete account of the final years has to include both. Patients experienced the process unevenly. A resident approved for community placement might visit a group home before moving. Staff could explain the new arrangement and practice daily skills. The patient might receive help learning to shop, use public transportation, prepare simple food, or manage personal possessions. Another patient might be transferred to a different state hospital. That move reduced Byberry's population without ending institutional confinement. The resident exchanged one ward for another, often farther from familiar employees or family. The closing process therefore contained two different policies. One was the movement of patients into community programs. The other was the movement of patients into other institutions. Later accounts of the shutdown sometimes described it as a complete victory for community care. The actual outcome was more complicated. Some residents entered supported settings outside hospitals. Others were transferred elsewhere because suitable community placements were unavailable, or because professionals believed they required continued institutional care. Speed created additional danger. A federal court reviewing a later Pennsylvania institutional closure case examined the Byberry experience and noted that about 350 residents had been placed in the community within 2.5 years after the closure announcement. The parties in that case agreed that this initial pace had not supported residents' safety and well-being adequately. The remaining residents were placed more slowly, over roughly 15 months with greater care. That finding exposes the central risk of closing a failed institution. Once political leaders announce a deadline, the number of people remaining becomes a measure of progress. Every placement lowers the census. Administrators can show that closure is moving forward. The quality of each placement is harder to summarize. A group home may exist on paper but lack trained staff. A discharged person may receive medication but have no reliable way to attend appointments. A residence may be technically located in the community while offering little choice or freedom. The hospital had counted patients for decades. Closure could become another counting exercise unless someone examined what happened after each person left. The deaths of recently discharged former patients intensified concern and temporarily slowed aspects of the process. Advocates who had demanded closure also had to demand safeguards against hurried or unsuitable placement. Ending institutionalization required more than removing people from a building. It required support strong enough to prevent abandonment in a different form. For long-term residents, the emotional difficulty could be severe. Imagine leaving Byberry after 20 years. The room may have been crowded. The rules may have been restrictive. The institution may have caused fear and loss. It was still familiar. You knew where meals were served. You knew which corridor led to the yard. You knew the names of other residents. You knew which attendants spoke kindly and which ones to avoid. Outside, stores had changed. Bus routes had changed. Money looked different. Family members had aged or died. Neighbourhoods remembered from youth might no longer resemble the places in memory. Freedom could arrive with disorientation. A person who had spent years asking to leave might still panic when the moment came. Good transition planning recognised that contradiction. Patients needed choices, visits, explanation, and continued relationships. Poor transition planning treated discharge as transportation from one address to another. The state's promise was that funds used to operate Byberry would follow residents into alternative care. In theory, this was the financial basis for the new system. Money that once heated wards and paid institutional employees would support group homes, outpatient programs, case management, psychiatric treatment, and supervised living. Community care was divided among multiple agencies and providers. That division was sometimes called unbundling. Byberry had supplied nearly everything within one system: housing, meals, medication, supervision, work, recreation, and medical care. Its concentration of power had enabled abuse, but it had also placed responsibility in one identifiable institution. After closure, those services could come from separate organisations. One agency managed housing, another provided psychiatric treatment, a different program handled employment or daytime activity. A case manager attempted to connect them. This structure allowed services to be more individualised and less restrictive. It also created gaps. When something failed, responsibility could be passed from one provider to another. A patient could lose housing because symptoms worsened, then lose treatment because transportation failed, then enter a hospital because the crisis became severe. Byberry's walls had trapped people inside one system. The community model sometimes allowed people to fall between several systems. That did not make closure a mistake. The hospital's continued operation had become indefensible. It meant that the long goodbye required more than shutting the gates. By early 1990, only a small group of residents remained. The process had taken longer than the original target date because suitable arrangements could not be created safely for everyone at once. The last patients left Philadelphia State Hospital by June 30th, 1990. A later federal court described that date as the formal closing of the hospital's doors. The institution, founded as the City Farms at Byberry, had lasted more than 8 decades. No final ceremony could summarise what had happened there. For some former patients, closure ended years of confinement. For others, it meant transfer to another controlled setting. Employees cleared offices and turned in keys. Records were boxed. Equipment was moved or left behind. The Commonwealth retained a large campus filled with ageing buildings no longer used for psychiatric care. The hospital had closed. Byberry had not disappeared. Vacant institutional buildings create a particular kind of public fascination. They preserve visible evidence of activity while removing the people who once gave that activity meaning. Beds remain without patients. Offices remain without employees. Signs continue pointing toward wards that no longer operate. Paint peels. Water enters through damaged roofs. Plants grow through cracks. Paper records scatter across floors. The abandoned Byberry campus became known to trespassers, explorers, vandals, and people drawn to stories of haunted places. Its reputation as one of America's worst mental hospitals made the empty buildings attractive to anyone seeking evidence of horror. Visitors entered through broken windows and unsecured doors. They photographed corridors, treatment rooms, underground passages, and decaying dormitories. Graffiti spread across the walls. Fires and vandalism caused additional damage. The grounds became a public safety problem for surrounding neighbourhoods. The abandonment changed the way Byberry was remembered. While the hospital operated, its history centred on patients, staff, policies, treatment, and public responsibility. After closure, the buildings themselves became the story. Rumours grew. Tales circulated about secret rooms, violent ghosts, medical experiments, and hidden deaths. Some accounts were connected loosely to documented abuse. Others were invented or repeated without evidence. The real history was already disturbing enough. Thousands of people had lived inside a system that often denied them privacy, freedom, and adequate care. That history did not require supernatural additions. The fascination with ruins could also recreate the same problem that had shaped Byberry during its operation. Patients disappeared from view. Their experiences became scenery. An empty restraint room made a dramatic photograph, but it did not explain who had been restrained, why the practice continued, or what happened after the person left. A decaying ward looked frightening, but the decay occurred after patients were gone. It could distract from the fact that many abuses took place while the buildings were heated, staffed, and officially described as a hospital. The campus remained vacant for more than a decade. Pennsylvania and Philadelphia had to resolve questions involving ownership, land use, environmental hazards, demolition costs, and redevelopment. The property's history complicated every proposal. Asbestos, structural danger, contamination, and the scale of the site made reuse difficult. The Commonwealth had already considered transferring or reallocating parts of the property before the hospital closed. A 1975 Pennsylvania law referred to the state's intention to cease using Byberry facilities for mental health care and authorised the transfer of certain tracts. The legislation shows how long the hospital's future had been uncertain before the final closure order. The remaining buildings survived into the 21st century. Their continued presence allowed Byberry's reputation to grow among urban explorers and local residents. The hospital became known not only as a failed institution, but as an abandoned place where entering was dangerous and forbidden. Demolition eventually began after the property was sold for redevelopment. The surviving hospital buildings were removed between 2006 and 2008. Brick, concrete, steel, glass, and institutional equipment were hauled away. Road patterns changed. New development replaced parts of the former campus. A person passing the area afterward could move through a landscape that no longer announced what had once stood there. Demolition solved the problem of dangerous ruins. It did not answer what should be remembered. Byberry's final years are sometimes described as the inevitable end of an outdated hospital. That description is too easy. The institution did not simply become obsolete in the way an old machine becomes obsolete. It was closed because repeated efforts to reform it had failed, because legal and moral standards had changed, because the state could no longer defend continued abuse, and because another model of care had become possible. The replacement system remained incomplete. That is why the closing cannot be treated as a simple victory. Byberry had concentrated neglect behind walls. Community-based care could disperse neglect across shelters, boarding homes, emergency rooms, jails, and streets. The suffering became less visible, but did not always disappear. A former patient living independently with proper support represented the promise of deinstitutionalization. A former patient abandoned without housing represented its failure. Both outcomes followed the same hospital closure. The long goodbye therefore continued after June 1990. It continued in the lives of people learning to live outside. It continued in families reconnecting with relatives they had known mainly through visits. It continued among employees who defended their work or regretted what they had witnessed. It continued through court cases examining whether Pennsylvania had created suitable community placements. It continued in the empty buildings until they were demolished. Byberry was gone as an institution, but the questions that created it remained. What does a society do when a person cannot live safely without help? Who provides that help when families cannot? How much control should doctors, courts and governments possess? What happens when care is expensive and the people needing it have little political influence? The hospital had answered those questions with land, buildings, locked doors and a large workforce. Closing it removed that answer. The final task is to look at what Byberry left behind. Not the ghost stories attached to its ruins, but the legal changes, public warnings, and unresolved failures that still shape mental health care long after the last patient walked out. Byberry disappeared from the Philadelphia landscape, but the problems that created it did not disappear with the buildings. The hospital was demolished. Its wards, tunnels, kitchens, dormitories and treatment rooms were removed. New development changed the appearance of the former grounds. A person can pass through the area today without seeing the large institution that once held thousands of patients. The absence of the buildings makes it easier to treat Byberry as a completed story. It is not. Byberry still matters because it shows how a system can begin with a reasonable public purpose and gradually become harmful. Philadelphia needed somewhere to care for people who were mentally ill, intellectually disabled, elderly, injured, homeless, or unable to live independently. Families needed assistance. Hospitals and police departments needed somewhere to send people during crises. City officials believed that large rural institutions could provide shelter, work, treatment, and supervision. The original problem was real. The solution created another problem because the institution became responsible for more people than it could properly care for. Overcrowding weakened sanitation, medical treatment, safety, and personal attention. Low wages made it difficult to keep experienced employees. Patient labour became part of the hospital's operating system. Restraint and punishment replaced individual care when workers lacked time, training, or alternatives. Byberry did not become notorious because every person who worked there was cruel. It became notorious because the system could continue functioning even when cruelty occurred. Meals were still prepared, patients were still counted, reports were still submitted, employees still completed their shifts. The institution remained open. A hospital can appear functional from an administrative distance while failing the people inside it. That is one of Byberry's most important lessons. Public institutions often measure what is easiest to count. They count beds, admissions, discharges, staff vacancies, treatment sessions, medication costs, and annual expenses. These figures are necessary. Governments cannot operate hospitals without budgets and records. Numbers do not reveal everything. A report can state that a ward contains 50 patients. It may not show that one of them has not spoken to a doctor in weeks. It may not show that another is afraid of an attendant. It may not show that a person has stopped asking to go home because no one ever answers. Byberry teaches us to look beyond whether a system is operating and ask what that operation feels like to the person with the least power inside it. That question applies to more than psychiatric hospitals. It applies to nursing homes, prisons, shelters, residential schools, juvenile facilities, group homes, immigration detention centres, and any place where one organisation controls most parts of a person's daily life. Closed systems create opportunities for care. They can provide safety, regular meals, medication, supervision, and protection from immediate danger. They also create opportunities for abuse. The people running the institution control access to information. They decide who may enter, what visitors may see, and how complaints are recorded. Employees can explain injuries using professional language. Administrators can prepare buildings before inspections. Residents who describe mistreatment may be dismissed as confused, unstable, dishonest, or difficult. Byberry's patients faced an especially severe version of this problem. Their diagnoses weakened their credibility. If a patient claimed that an attendant had struck them, staff could say the patient was delusional. If someone became angry about poor treatment, that anger could be recorded as evidence of mental illness. If a resident resisted restraint, employees could describe the resistance as proof that restraint was necessary. The institution possessed the power to interpret every reaction. This is why outside oversight matters. families, lawyers, journalists, inspectors, judges, advocates, and independent medical professionals provide ways for information to leave a closed institution. None of these protections is perfect. Families may not visit. Inspectors can miss abuse. Journalists may focus only on dramatic cases. Courts act slowly. Without outside attention, an institution can create its own definition of normal. At Byberry, nakedness in overcrowded rooms became normal. Long periods of restraint became normal. Patients sitting for hours without meaningful activity became normal. Staff shortages became normal. Practices that would have shocked an outsider could seem ordinary to someone who encountered them every day. The conscientious objectors who worked at Byberry during the Second World War are important for this reason. They entered the hospital without having spent years adapting to its culture. They saw conditions that long-time employees may have accepted as unavoidable. Some of the men had little psychiatric experience. They did not possess a complete solution. Their refusal to accept violence as normal still changed the historical record. They wrote about what they saw. They took photographs. They carried evidence beyond the hospital. Those actions remind us that institutions rarely reform themselves without pressure. Employees who report wrongdoing are often described as disloyal. Administrators may argue that public exposure damages staff morale or reduces trust. Silence protects morale only for the people who benefit from silence. For patients experiencing abuse, exposure may be the only available form of protection. Byberry also teaches us to be careful when a difficult social problem is solved mainly through removal. Philadelphia removed mentally ill and disabled people from crowded neighborhoods, police stations, almshouses, and family homes. The city placed them on a large property near its edge. Once they were gone from ordinary public spaces, their needs became less visible. The city appeared more orderly. The suffering continued elsewhere. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Governments remove people from public view and describe the removal as a solution. The institution becomes distant enough that most citizens encounter it only through budgets, rumours, or occasional scandals. Distance reduces political pressure. A family living beside an unsafe road can demand repairs because the danger is visible every day. A patient confined in a locked ward may have no way to contact a legislator. Even when that patient does make contact, officials may assume the hospital knows best. Byberry grew partly because the public system had nowhere else to send people. That explanation was true, but it became an excuse to avoid building alternatives. Community clinics cost money. Home care programs cost money. Supported housing costs money. Training and retaining qualified workers costs money. Large institutions also cost money, but their expenses can be concentrated into one budget and one location. They allow the rest of society to continue without confronting the daily needs of the people inside. Byberry shows the long-term cost of that convenience. The hospital became so large that closing it appeared almost impossible. Thousands of residents depended on it for food, shelter, medical care, and supervision. Employees depended on it for wages. Courts, police departments, and families depended on it as a destination. The institution became necessary because the public had allowed every alternative to remain inadequate. That is how harmful systems survive. They do not need to prove that they are good. They need only to appear less difficult than replacing them. The medical history of Byberry offers another warning. New treatments can bring genuine progress while also serving the needs of the institution. Electroconvulsive therapy helped some patients with severe depression, mania, and catatonia. Antipsychotic medication reduced hallucinations and delusions for many people who had previously spent years in locked wards. These developments allowed patients to return to families and communities. The same treatments could be misused. A heavily medicated patient was easier to supervise. A quiet ward required fewer employees. A person who stopped resisting might be described as improved, even if the treatment had caused severe side effects, confusion, or emotional withdrawal. Byberry teaches us that the result most convenient for staff is not always the result best for the patient. This remains relevant whenever someone receives treatment without meaningful choice. The question should not be limited to whether behaviour has become easier to manage. Has the person's suffering decreased? Can they think clearly? Can they communicate? Can they make decisions? Can they participate in life beyond the treatment setting? Can they refuse or request changes without being punished? A person who becomes silent is not necessarily well. An institution that becomes quiet is not necessarily humane. The movement to close state hospitals grew from recognition of these failures. Large institutions had isolated people, weakened independence, and allowed abuse to continue behind locked doors. Community treatment promised something better. Patients would live near families. They would receive care without surrendering every part of daily life. Hospital stays would be shorter. Medication, counselling, housing, work programs and crisis services would help people remain outside institutions. For many former patients, this change created real freedom. People who might once have spent decades in a state hospital lived in apartments, group homes or family houses. They used public transportation, chose their own clothing, prepared food, formed relationships, and participated in their communities. Byberry should not be remembered as evidence that deinstitutionalization was a mistake. It should be remembered as evidence that institutionalization carried serious dangers. The failure came when governments closed hospitals without creating enough community support. A hospital bed can be eliminated by administrative order. A stable life cannot. A person leaving a long-term institution may need housing, income, medication, medical care, counselling, transportation, help with daily tasks, and someone available during a crisis. They may need assistance for years. Some people need support for the rest of their lives. When those services are incomplete, the person does not become independent through lack of help. They become vulnerable. Former patients have sometimes moved from hospitals into shelters, unstable boarding homes, emergency rooms and jails. Others have lived on streets or moved repeatedly between brief hospital stays and unsafe housing. This is not freedom in any meaningful sense. Byberry's closure teaches that the location of neglect can change without neglect ending. Inside an institution, neglect is concentrated. It exists in one group of wards under one administration. Outside, neglect can be scattered. A person may lose housing because one agency fails, medication because another agency fails, and crisis treatment because a third service has no available space. No single organisation appears completely responsible. The old institution had too much control. The fragmented system can have too little responsibility. Good mental health care has to avoid both failures. People need protection from unnecessary confinement. They also need dependable support when illness or disability makes independent living difficult. These needs are not opposites. Freedom without support can become abandonment. Support without freedom can become control. Byberry stands near the centre of that difficult balance. Its history also forces us to consider the people who provided care. It is easy to describe attendants and hospital workers as one group. The record does not support that simplification. Some employees abused patients, some threatened them, struck them, ignored them, or used restraints as punishment. Others worked under exhausting conditions and tried to protect residents. They fed people who could not feed themselves. They cleaned patients who had no control over bodily functions. They separated fights, dressed wounds, wrote letters for residents, and stayed on difficult wards because someone needed to do the work. The same institution contained cruelty, indifference, competence, and compassion. This does not weaken responsibility. It helps us understand where responsibility belongs. Hiring people into an unsafe system without training, support, supervision, and adequate pay creates predictable danger. Employees become exhausted. Experienced workers leave. New workers learn from whatever culture already exists. The harshest staff members can influence the entire ward because their methods appear fast and effective. Protecting patients, therefore, requires protecting the quality of the workforce. Care work cannot be treated as unskilled simply because it involves feeding, bathing, dressing, listening and supervising rather than operating expensive equipment. These tasks require judgment, patience, physical effort, emotional control, and knowledge of individual behaviour. When society pays little for this work, it communicates how little it values the people receiving it. Byberry's low staffing and poor conditions were not accidents separate from its budget. They were the physical form of that budget. Every unfilled position meant less attention. Every delayed repair became part of a patient's living environment. Every training program that was never funded increased the chance that force would replace skill. The condition of an institution reveals what the public is willing to spend on people who cannot easily demand more. This is not only a historical point. Modern mental health systems still face worker shortages, high turnover, limited crisis services, and inadequate housing. Families still struggle to care for relatives with serious psychiatric conditions. Police officers still respond to situations that would be handled better by mental health professionals. Emergency departments still hold patients because appropriate beds or community placements are unavailable. The language has changed. The pressure remains familiar. A person in crisis needs somewhere to go. A family needs help immediately. A public agency looks for an available placement. The danger begins when availability becomes more important than suitability. Byberry accepted people because other systems had no answer. Once admitted, they could remain for years. Modern systems should not repeat that pattern by moving people into any available setting without asking whether it meets their actual needs. The history also warns against using fear as the main way to discuss mental illness. Byberry is often presented through horror stories. The abandoned buildings, secret tunnels, restraints, violence, and rumours of ghosts make the hospital easy to turn into entertainment. The documented history is more important than the legend. Most patients were not monsters. They were people experiencing illness, disability, age, injury, poverty, grief, confusion or abandonment. Some behaved violently. Others were vulnerable to violence. Many spent long periods doing ordinary things inside an extraordinary system. Eating, sleeping, working, smoking, talking, waiting, and hoping for visits. When the hospital is described only as terrifying, the people confined there can become part of the horror. That repeats the old mistake. Byberry was frightening because of what happened to patients, not because mentally ill people existed inside it. The distinction should remain clear. A person experiencing psychosis may hear voices, misunderstand danger, or behave unpredictably. That person can still feel pain, humiliation, loneliness, affection and fear. Disability does not reduce the need for dignity. Confusion does not eliminate rights. The more dependent a person is, the greater the responsibility of the people controlling their care. Byberry repeatedly reversed that principle. The patients least able to complain often received the worst treatment. People who could not dress themselves were left without clothing. People who could not use bathrooms independently lived in dirty conditions. People unable to explain injuries could be ignored. Residents without families received less outside attention. A humane system has to do the opposite. It must provide stronger safeguards to people who have less ability to protect themselves. The final lesson concerns memory. Byberry's demolition removed the physical evidence that had dominated local attention. Empty buildings had become dangerous, and redevelopment returned the land to public use. Demolition was practical. It also made forgetting easier. There is no large hospital complex forcing visitors to ask what happened inside. The former patients are scattered. Many have died. Employees have aged. Records remain in archives, but most people will never read them. Memory, therefore, depends on how the story is told. It should not be told only as a list of shocking abuses. It should explain the decisions that allowed those abuses to continue. It should include the families who lacked alternatives It should include the workers who tried to improve conditions. It should include the patients who built friendships, performed labour, survived treatment, left the hospital or died there. It should also include the public officials and citizens who were warned repeatedly. Byberry was investigated before it closed. Its conditions were photographed. Books and magazines described the wards. Courts examined its practices. Reformers demanded change. The institution did not continue because no one knew. It continued because knowing and acting are different things. Action required money, political commitment, new services, trained employees, legal protection, and public willingness to remain interested after the most shocking photographs disappeared from view. That may be the most direct lesson Byberry leaves us. Scandal can create attention. Only sustained responsibility creates change. A society cannot protect vulnerable people by becoming concerned for a few weeks after an investigation. It has to maintain oversight during ordinary years when there is no famous photograph, no national article, and no politician promising reform. The quality of care has to matter when no one is watching. Byberry began as an answer to overcrowding elsewhere. It became overcrowded itself. It expanded to solve that problem and grew more difficult to manage. New treatments reduced symptoms but also created new methods of control. Closure ended institutional confinement for many people, but exposed the weakness of community support. At every stage, one improvement created another responsibility. The institution failed whenever officials treated the first step as the complete solution. Building a hospital was not enough. Calling it a hospital was not enough. Developing treatment was not enough. Closing the hospital was not enough. Care required attention to what happened next. That responsibility remains with us. The buildings are gone, but there will always be people whose needs are expensive, complicated, and difficult to manage. There will always be pressure to place them somewhere out of sight. There will always be institutions and agencies explaining that they are doing the best they can with limited resources. Sometimes that explanation will be true. It cannot be the end of the inquiry. We still have to ask whether people are safe. We still have to ask whether they are heard. We still have to ask whether treatment serves them or merely controls them. We still have to ask whether freedom comes with enough support to make it real. Byberry does not give us a simple model to follow. It gives us a record of what happens when responsibility is delayed, divided, and hidden. The hospital's history began with people being sent away because no better answer existed. It ended with people being sent back into communities that were not always ready to receive them. Between those moments stood decades of locked doors, medical experiments, daily labour, staff shortages, public investigations, reform attempts, and lives spent inside a system that often knew more about counting patients than understanding them. The former grounds no longer announce that history. Remembering it is now a choice. That choice matters because the conditions that produced Byberry were not unique to one city or one century. They begin whenever a society decides that certain people are too difficult, too costly, or too powerless to remain visible. They continue whenever confinement is mistaken for care. They end only when the person inside the system is treated as more important than the convenience of the system itself.